The river wanted to kill them. Caleb Turner heard the screaming before he saw anything. Two voices tearing through the roar of spring floodwater, raw and desperate as wounded animals. He ran without thinking, crashed through the brush, and found them, two young Chinese women clinging to a half-submerged tree, the current ripping at their bodies, the water black and merciless beneath the Wyoming sky. He had survived a war. He had buried his brother. He had sworn to stay away from the world and everything in it. But some things a man cannot walk away from. Some things find you anyway. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Caleb Turner woke to find ice still crusting the edges of his water bucket, he took it as a sign that Wyoming wasn't finished punishing him for the winter. He cracked the ice with 2 fingers, splashed the cold water across his face, and stood in the doorway of his cabin watching the sky turn from black to the color of a bruise. It was April of 1874, though Caleb kept no calendar. He tracked time the way old men and cattle did, by the cold, by the light, by the way the land smelled when it was about to change. And the land had been changing for 3 days straight. The snowpack up in the Absaroka Range was breaking loose all at once, feeding every creek and tributary that fed into the Green River Fork that ran a quarter mile behind his property. He could hear it at night when the wind died down, a low, sustained roar like something breathing heavy in its sleep, something large and not entirely patient. Caleb was 34 years old and looked 50, not because life had broken him, though it had come close, but because the mountains aged a man in a particular way, carved the softness out of him the way water carves stone, slowly and without apology. He had a lean, angular face, a jaw that hadn't seen a blade in 2 weeks, and eyes the pale gray color of river ice. His hands were rough-knuckled and capable, the hands of a man who had learned to do everything alone. He had been alone for 6 years. Before that, there had been the war. Before the war, there had been his brother Daniel, who was 2 years younger and twice as loud and dead at Chickamauga with a Confederate rifle ball through his sternum. Caleb had carried him off the field himself, or tried to, until Daniel made him stop and put him down and told him to go. He had gone. He had never forgiven himself for going, and he suspected he never would. After the armistice, he had drifted west, not with any particular purpose, but the way a man drifts when he has no anchor and no particular reason to stop. Until one late summer afternoon in 1868, he had ridden into this valley in the Wyoming Territory and felt, for reasons he could not name, that this was as far as he was going. He filed a claim. He built the cabin with timber he cut himself. He ran a small herd of cattle with a neighbor's help until the neighbor moved his family to Utah, and then he ran them alone. He traded in Rollins twice a year and otherwise spoke to no one. Some men are made for solitude. Caleb wasn't sure if he was one of them, but he had gotten good at it. He spent that morning mending the fence on the north pasture, where the spring thaw had softened the earth and tilted 3 posts. He worked methodically, tamping earth with the butt of a sledgehammer, listening to the river. The sound of it had been building since dawn, louder now, more urgent, a restless, swollen sound. Around midday, he ate the last of his cornbread standing at the fence line, watching a pair of red-tailed hawks circle above the ridge. He was thinking about nothing in particular, which was his preferred state of mind, when the wind shifted out of the north and carried something to him. Sound. High and sharp and wrong. He went still, the way animals go still when they hear something their brain hasn't finished interpreting yet. There it was again. 2 voices. Screaming. Caleb dropped the sledgehammer and ran. The ground between the north fence and the river was rough going. Scrub brush, loose rock, the muddy margins where the floodwater had already crept 20 feet past the normal bank. Caleb crashed through it without slowing, his boots punching through the crust of half-frozen soil, his lungs pulling hard at the cold air. He was not a man who ran often. He ran now. He came out of the brush at the bank and saw them immediately. 20 yards downstream, where a massive cottonwood had fallen across a narrow bend in the river, 2 figures clung to the submerged trunk. The current was ferocious, brown and frothing, carrying branches and debris at a speed that made the eye uncomfortable to follow. The tree had saved them from being swept away entirely, but it was also pulling them under in pieces. Every surge of water pushed them lower, ripped at their grip, forced their faces toward the surface in desperate gasps. Two women, young, their clothing dark with water, spread around them like torn flags. "Hold on," Caleb shouted, though he wasn't sure they could hear him over the river's roar. He moved upstream of them along the bank, looking for something to work with. 50 feet back, he found what he needed. A length of rope he'd left coiled on a fence post at the river boundary when he'd been pulling a calf out of the mud 3 weeks ago. He grabbed it, tied one end around the base of a solid willow with knots that his hands knew how to make without his mind being involved, and then he waded in. The cold was immediate and absolute. The water hit his thighs and then his waist, and the shock of it squeezed the air from his chest like a fist. The current grabbed his legs and tried to walk him sideways. He leaned into it, driving forward with his shoulders, the rope uncoiling behind him. The bottom was treacherous, loose gravel and submerged rock, shifting under every step. He went down once to one knee and came up with a mouthful of brown water, spitting it clear, pushing forward. The roar of the river was all around him now, a physical thing, pressing against his ears. He reached the cottonwood trunk and grabbed hold. Up close, he could see them clearly. 2 young women, Chinese, their faces pale with cold and shock, their eyes fixed on him with the particular intensity of people who have decided not to die yet. They were identical in the way twins sometimes are, not just in features but in expression, as if the same soul had been poured into 2 vessels. Both of them were bleeding, one from a gash on her forearm, one from somewhere on her scalp, a thin thread of blood mixing with the river water on her temple. "I've got a rope," Caleb said, loudly and slowly. He wasn't sure how much English they spoke. "Can you reach it?" The one closer to him, her eyes were slightly darker, her jaw set harder, stretched out one hand from the tree trunk and grabbed the rope. Her grip was strong. He felt it through the line. "Good," he said. "Hold that. Don't let go for anything." He looked at the second woman, who was farther out along the trunk, the current pulling harder at her because the bend in the river was just beyond her position. She was watching him with the same intent, desperate focus, but she wasn't going to be able to reach the rope from where she was. "I'm coming to you," he told her, not knowing if she understood, and moved along the cottonwood trunk hand over hand. The river did not want him to get there. The current at the bend was something savage, not just fast but forceful, pushing against him like a living thing with a specific intention. His feet left the bottom entirely for a moment, and he was horizontal in the water, holding the trunk with both hands, the rope still connected to his belt loop through a hasty half-hitch he'd tied while wading in. He pulled himself back, got one foot down, then the other. The second woman was looking at him. She had stopped fighting the current, not from surrender, he realized, but from intelligence. She had found the most stable position available to her and held it, conserving what strength she had left. That kind of thinking under pressure told him something about her. "Give me your hand," he said, reaching. She reached back. Their hands found each other. Her grip was every bit as strong as her sister's. Caleb pulled her in against the trunk, got his arm around her waist, and then began the slow, brutal work of getting back across the current. He moved them both hand over hand along the cottonwood, the rope a guideline more than a lifeline, the cold eating into his bones with every second. The woman with the darker eyes was still holding the far end of the rope. When he reached her, he got his other arm around her, and for a long moment the 3 of them were simply pressed against the fallen tree, catching breath, assessing the distance remaining. "Almost there," Caleb said. It was as much for himself as for them. They went together. He guided, they moved, the rope held. The bank came up under his feet and then under theirs, and then they were crawling up out of the mud and the cold into the thin, pale sunlight of a Wyoming April, and Caleb was on his hands and knees in the grass, breathing like a man who has just remembered what air is for. Neither woman spoke for a long time. Caleb sat up and looked at them. They were sitting close together in the way that twins do, a proximity born less of habit than of nature, as if they shared a gravitational field. Both of them were shivering violently. The one whose scalp was bleeding had pressed her sleeve against the wound with automatic practicality. The other was looking at Caleb with an expression he couldn't read. Gratitude, certainly, but something else underneath it. Calculation, maybe? Wariness. The look of someone deciding how much danger she was in. He decided not to push them. He had been pushed himself in worse moments, by people who meant well and didn't understand that sometimes a person needs a minute before they can be people again. "My cabin's about a quarter-mile north," he said, keeping his voice level. "You need to get out of those wet clothes before the cold sets in for real. You can have what's dry that I've got." He paused. "Nobody's going to hurt you." The one with the harder jaw, the one who had been closer to him on the log, who had taken the rope first, looked at her sister. Something passed between them in a glance, the compressed communication of people who have shared everything since before birth. She looked back at Caleb. "We walk?" she said. Her English was careful and precise, shaped by someone who had learned it as a second language and was determined to use it correctly. "We walk," he confirmed. "Can you?" She stood, steadied herself, and offered her sister a hand up. "Yes," she said. "We can walk." The cabin was small but solid. One main room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft above, a small lean-to kitchen built against the back wall. Caleb had built it with function in mind rather than comfort, but there was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a wood stove in the kitchen, and enough firewood stacked against the interior wall to last a week of hard cold. He got the fireplace going first, feeding it with split pine until the room began to hold some warmth, and then turned to find the 2 women standing just inside the doorway, taking stock. They were looking at everything, not with greed or with suspicion, but with the careful attention of people who have learned that the details of a space tell you the nature of the person who occupies it. What they saw: a single man's cabin, sparse and clean, a rifle on a rack above the door, well-oiled, a Bible on the shelf that had not been opened in some time, the cover dusty, a dried sprig of sage tucked in the pages as a bookmark, a workbench with tools laid out in careful order, a shelf of canned goods and dried beans, no women's items, no child's items, no evidence of anything warmer than practical necessity. Whatever conclusion they drew from it, neither of them shared it. "I'm Caleb Turner," he said. "This is my land." The one with the darker eyes said, "I am Lena. This is Maylene." She gestured to her sister. "We are, She paused, choosing the word, "grateful." Maylene was looking at the fireplace with an expression that might have been longing. "I have dry shirts and a pair of trousers and some wool socks," Caleb said. "They won't fit right, but they'll be dry. There's a curtain you can pull across the loft stairs." He was conscious, suddenly, of the awkwardness of it. A lone man, 2 young women, the intimacy forced by circumstance. "I'll stay in the kitchen while you change." He did. He put water on for coffee, and because he had nothing better to offer, he set a pot of dried beans soaking and sliced the remaining half of a cured ham. His hands were still numb. He stood close to the wood stove and let the heat work its way back into his fingers while he listened to the sounds from the main room. Quiet footsteps, the soft sound of a curtain being drawn. After a while, Lena appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was wearing his second-best flannel shirt, which fell to her knees, and a pair of wool socks that bunched at her ankles. She had braided her wet hair. The cut on Maylene's scalp, he noticed when Maylene appeared behind her, had been tied closed with a strip of cloth torn from something, neatly and tightly. They looked, despite everything, composed. "Sit down if you like," Caleb said, nodding toward the table. "Coffee's not ready yet. Ham will take a while." Lena sat. Maylene remained standing for a moment, then sat beside her. Caleb turned back to the stove. "How did you come to be in the river?" he asked, not turning around. He had found, over years of solitude, that people sometimes spoke more freely when no one was looking directly at them. A pause. Then Lena's voice, careful and measured. "We fell." Caleb said nothing, just let the silence sit there. Another pause. Longer. "We were crossing," Maylene said. Her English was different from her sister's. Softer, less practiced, but with a directness that Lena's more careful speech sometimes smoothed over. "The water was lower yesterday. We thought we could cross." "Running from something," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. The silence that followed was answer enough. He poured coffee into his 2 tin cups and set them on the table and went back for the pot, which he set on a folded cloth between them. Then he leaned against the kitchen wall and crossed his arms and looked at them. Not aggressively, not with the look of a man who expects payment for his help. Just looking. You don't have to tell me anything, he said. I'm not asking for a story, but you're going to need dry land to sleep on tonight, and I don't turn people out. So whatever it is you're running from, it doesn't follow you in here. Not tonight. Lena wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked into it. Maylene looked at Caleb with those direct, assessing eyes. You are a kind man? She asked. The question was genuine, not rhetorical. The question of someone who has learned not to assume. Caleb thought about it for a moment. I try to be, he said. I don't always manage it, but I try. Maylene nodded slowly, as if this were a satisfactory answer, as if a man who tried and sometimes failed were more trustworthy than one who claimed to always succeed. He gave them the loft. He slept on the floor near the fireplace, which was not comfortable but was warm, and he slept better than he usually did. Something about the sounds of other breathing in the cabin, he supposed, other lives occupying the same space. It had been a long time since that had been true. In the morning, he was up before them. He had fed the fire and put coffee on and was out splitting wood when Lena appeared in the doorway, wearing the same oversized flannel, watching him with the mug he'd left on the table. Your hands are better, he said, glancing at her fingers wrapped around the cup. She looked at them. Yes. The cold had left. He split another piece and tossed it onto the pile. How long have you been in Wyoming? 8 months, she said. We came with our father from San Francisco. Your father? He worked on the railroad. She said it with a particular flatness that told him the sentence was not finished. He died 3 months ago. There was an accident. The word accident carried a weight that suggested she was not entirely sure it had been one. A beam fell on the crews that were blasting through the rock near Bitter Creek. Caleb set the axe down and looked at her. I'm sorry, he said. He meant it. He knew what it was to lose a person and have no ground under your feet afterward. After he died, Lena continued, her voice still careful, still measured, a man named Briggs came to us. He was the foreman over our father's crew. He said our father had borrowed money for our passage from San Francisco, for our food and housing while he worked. She paused. He said the debt was now ours. Caleb felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the morning air. He said we owed him labor, Lena said, and he said that if we left, if we ran, he had men who would find us and bring us back. So you ran anyway, Caleb said. For the first time since he'd met her, something crossed Lena's face that was not composure, not exactly a smile, more the ghost of one, brief and complicated. Yes, she said. We ran anyway. Over the next 3 days, pieces of the larger story came out in fragments, the way stories do when the people telling them aren't sure yet how much trust they have to spend. Their father's name had been Wei Chen. He had been a careful, proud man who had sacrificed everything to bring his daughters out of southern China after their mother's death, convinced that America held possibilities that their village could not. He had worked the transcontinental lines, and then the smaller branch lines that were still being carved through the mountain territories, always sending money home to his brother in San Francisco, always believing that the work would end and the next stage of life would begin. The work had ended. So had Wei Chen. Briggs, whose first name neither sister knew, who was perhaps defined entirely by that single hard surname, had appeared the morning after the burial with a ledger book and a calm, businesslike manner that made the whole encounter more terrifying than rage would have been. He spoke to them in front of the other workers, many of whom looked away. He showed them numbers written in the ledger. He told them the amounts were owed, and then, with the patience of a man who knows he holds all the cards, he told them where they would sleep, what they would do, and when they would be permitted to speak to anyone outside his supervision. They had lasted 6 weeks under his control before Maylene had decided she would rather drown than stay. It had been Maylene's plan, Caleb gathered. Lena was the one who thought through consequences, who weighed odds and measured risks. Maylene was the one who, when a thing had to be done, simply did it. They had slipped away in the early hours of a Tuesday morning with what they could carry, a small bundle of clothes, their father's pocket watch, and enough dried food for 2 days of walking. They had been walking for 11 days when the river took them. On the 4th morning, Caleb found Maylene in the kitchen before sunrise. She had built up the wood stove herself and was standing at the counter, looking at his small collection of food stores with the same systematic attention she seemed to bring to everything. "Can I make something?" she asked when she heard him behind her. He blinked. "If you like." "We had a kitchen in San Francisco," she said, not as explanation but as information, the way people share facts they have not had occasion to mention yet. "Our aunt's kitchen. I learned there." 20 minutes later, she produced something from dried cornmeal and water and the last of the salt pork that bore a closer resemblance to a proper meal than anything Caleb had managed in months. He sat at the table and ate without speaking, and Maylene sat across from him and watched him eat with a look of quiet satisfaction. "You live here alone," she said. "Yes." "A long time." 6 years. She considered this. Why? It was the kind of direct question that most people had the social instincts to avoid. Caleb found he didn't mind it. "Seemed easier," he said. "Easier than what?" He looked at her. "Than most of the alternatives." Maylene studied him for a moment with those dark, level eyes. Then she nodded, not as though she agreed, but as though she understood the logic, even if she might have chosen differently. Lena appeared on the stairs and looked between them. "You should have woken me," she said to Maylene. "You were sleeping." "So?" "So I didn't wake you." Maylene stood and poured coffee into a cup and handed it to her sister. "Sit down. Eat." Lena sat. She looked at Caleb with an expression he was beginning to recognize, a slightly apologetic acknowledgement of her sister's bluntness. "She is direct," she said. "I noticed," Caleb said. "I don't mind it." Maylene, already back at the stove, said nothing, but appeared faintly pleased. Gus. By the end of the first week, a shape had emerged in the days that had not been there before. Not a routine exactly. The three of them were too new to each other for anything that organized, but a rhythm. Caleb worked the outside, the fence, the cattle, the endless maintenance that a property in these mountains demanded. The sisters worked the inside, which Caleb had neglected in ways that were now becoming apparent to him as they quietly and systematically corrected them. It was Lena who found, on the third day, that one of his roof beams had developed dry rot and showed him where the water damage would spread if left unaddressed. She had pulled back the loft flooring planks to show him, calmly and precisely, the way a person shows a problem who expects to help solve it. Caleb had stood there looking at it, and then looked at her. "How do you know about roof beams?" he asked. "Our father built things," she said simply. "He taught us what he knew." Caleb thought about that. A man working the railroad, sleeping in work camps, still finding the hours to teach his daughters the geometry of load-bearing structures. He thought about what kind of person that made Wei Chun, and he thought about what kind of daughters that made Lena and Maylene. "All right," he said. "We'll fix it." They fixed it together, the three of them, Caleb cutting the replacement timber, and Lena directing its placement with a precision that he would have found irritating from almost anyone else but found, from her, simply reliable. Maylene handed up materials from below and commented on everything with a candor that made both Caleb and Lena alternately laugh and tell her to be quiet. He realized, bracing the new beam in place with his shoulder while Lena drove the first spike, that he had not laughed, not genuinely, not the kind that catches you off guard, in long enough that he couldn't remember the last time. The evenings were the most complicated. After supper, in the firelight, the careful distances of the day compressed. There was only the one room and the warmth of the fire and the natural human gravity of people who have shared a day's work. Caleb was not a storyteller by nature, but Lena was. Or rather, she asked questions the way some people tell stories, drawing things out with a patience that made the other person realize, only after the fact, that they'd said more than they'd intended. On the fifth evening, without quite knowing how it happened, Caleb found himself talking about Daniel. Not the whole of it, not the worst parts, but the shape of him. A younger brother who had been loud and funny and alive in the way that some people are, as if the world were specifically their audience. Who had taught Caleb to play cards and cheated every time and laughed when he was caught. Who had followed Caleb to war because he said he wasn't going to let his brother have an adventure without him. "He sounds like someone who believed everything would work out," Lena said. Caleb looked at the fire. "He did. Right up until it didn't." A silence. Then, "My father was like that," Lena said. "He believed that the next place would be the right place. that the work would get better, that things would change. A pause. They did not change, but he kept believing. Is that better or worse? Caleb asked, believing until the end. Lena was quiet for a long moment. Maylene, sitting on the floor near the fire with her knees pulled up, was looking into the flames with an expression that Caleb was learning to recognize as her thinking face. "It is better," Maylene said, without looking up. Her voice was quiet and certain. "To die still believing is better than to live having stopped." Caleb looked at her. She met his eyes briefly, then looked back at the fire. He thought about that for the rest of the night. On the 8th day, he rode into the north pasture at mid-morning and found a steer with a bad leg. A clean break, no hope for it. He dealt with it quickly and practically, the way a rancher does, and was loading the carcass onto the drag sled when he heard hoofbeats on the road. 2 riders, moving at a pace that said they were looking for something. Caleb left the sled and rode back toward the cabin at a pace that was not quite running, but was close. He got there 20 seconds before the riders did. Lena was at the woodpile. She saw his face when he came through the fence, and she dropped the wood she was carrying and was at the cabin door in 3 steps. "Inside," Caleb said. "Both of you, now." Maylene appeared in the doorway. She looked at Caleb, looked at the road, and went back inside without a word. Caleb dismounted and stood in front of his cabin, watching the 2 riders come up the road, and felt something in his chest that was familiar and cold and very old. He had felt it before battle, in the war. The particular stillness that comes over a body when it knows something is coming and has decided to meet it standing up. The riders pulled up at his fence line. Big men, both of them. One had the look of a hired hand who had graduated from cattle to other kinds of work. The other one had small, pale eyes and a meaty face, and wore his authority like a coat that had been cut for someone else, but that he'd decided to wear anyway. The second one leaned on his saddle horn and looked at the cabin, then at Caleb. "You Turner?" he said. "I am," Caleb said. "Name's Briggs. I'm looking for 2 Chinese women, twins. Ran off from my work camp about 2 weeks ago." He said it the way a man reports a missing tool. Flat, factual, without warmth. "I have reason to believe they came this way." Caleb said nothing. Briggs waited. Then, "They belong to me, Turner. They owe a debt. It's a legal matter." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. The wind came off the mountains and moved through the grass of the pasture and carried the sound of the river in the distance, steady and present as a held note. "I don't know anything about legal matters," Caleb said. His voice was even. "What I know is that you're on the wrong side of my fence line, and this is my land." Briggs's expression didn't change, but the hired hand's hand moved, not toward his gun, not yet, but in the direction of it. "I'm going to ask you straight," Briggs said. "Are those women on your property?" Caleb held his gaze without blinking. "What's on my property," he said, "is my business. You want to stand on the road and ask questions? You can do that. You want to come past this fence? You'll need a better reason than the one you've got." Briggs looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Then he straightened in his saddle, gathered his reins, and looked at the cabin one more time. "I'll be back," he said. "People generally do come back," Caleb said, "when they don't finish what they started." Briggs turned his horse. The hired hand followed. Caleb watched them ride down the road until they disappeared around the bend, and then he stood there for another full minute in the silence, letting the thing in his chest settle back down to where he could manage it. Then he went inside. The sisters were at the far end of the main room, standing close together. Lena's face was the color of winter ash. Maylene's jaw was set in a line that made her look, for a moment, more like stone than person. "You know that man?" Caleb said. It was not a question. "Yes," Lena said. "Briggs." "Yes." Caleb took his hat off and set it on the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at them. "All right," he said. "Tell me everything. Not the pieces, all of it." And this time they did. The full account took the better part of an hour. Lena told most of it, with Maylene filling in the pieces that Lena's careful language skipped over, the parts that required not precision but feeling, the texture of what it had been like rather than simply what had happened. Caleb sat at the table and listened the way he had learned to listen during the war, when information could mean the difference between a good decision and a fatal one, completely, without interrupting, without letting his face tell them what he thought, before they were finished. What emerged was worse than he'd imagined, and he had not imagined anything gentle. Wei Chen had indeed borrowed money from Briggs. This part was true, and Lena said it plainly, because she had learned that half-truths built on solid ground were more dangerous than honest ones. Their father had borrowed $40 to cover the cost of their passage from San Francisco because the railroad company had promised reimbursement that never came, and because a man does not leave his daughters in a city they don't know without money or shelter while he goes to work in the mountains. $40. He had been paying it back. Lena had seen the receipts, folded and tucked into his coat pocket, the amounts recorded in his careful hand. But Wei Chen had died before the debt was cleared, and the receipts had disappeared along with everything else his employer had considered his to take. Briggs had shown them a different ledger, a ledger that showed a different number entirely. Not $40, but $212, a sum that included, he explained with patient reasonableness, their housing at the camp for the 6 weeks after their father's death, their food, the cost of the man he'd sent to find them a placement in Rawlins. All of it calculated at rates that no one had agreed to for services that no one had requested, added up to a number that would take years of labor to repay at whatever wage he decided to assign to their work. What kind of work? Caleb asked. A pause. Domestic work, Lena said carefully. At first, cooking and cleaning for the camp, but Briggs had arrangements with a man in Rawlins who ran a— She stopped and chose the next word with visible deliberation. An establishment. He said we would be sent there when our camp work was done, to pay the remainder of the debt. The word establishment sat on the table between them like something dead. Caleb kept his face still. It required effort. There was a woman at the camp, Maylene said, her voice quiet and hard. Older. She had been there 2 years. She had come the same way. Debt, ledger, numbers that never went down no matter how she worked. She looked at Caleb. She told us to run. She said, don't wait, don't try to negotiate. Don't believe the numbers will ever be paid off. Just run. A beat. She could not run herself. Her feet had been damaged in the winter. She gave us her coat and her boots and told us to go before the snow melted and the roads opened up again. What was her name, Caleb asked. May, Maylene said. She said her name before was different, but that nobody used it anymore, so it didn't matter. She paused. It mattered to us. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and the river went on making its low, constant sound. How many men does Briggs run? He said. At the camp, many, Lena said, but he uses only a few for personal things. There were 2 with him today, perhaps 3 or 4 altogether that he trusts. The one with the pale eyes, Caleb said. That was Briggs himself. Yes, Caleb nodded slowly. He stood up from the table and went to the window and looked out at the empty road. The afternoon light was going golden on the hills, long and slanted, the kind of light that made the country look peaceful from a distance. He stood there for a while, thinking. He'll come back, he said finally, not turning around. Probably not today. He's the kind of man who thinks patience looks like power. He turned. But he'll come back, and he won't come with just 2 riders next time. Lena and Maylene looked at him steadily. What do we do? Lena asked. It was the first time either of them had used that word. We. Caleb noticed it. He suspected Lena had chosen it deliberately. We don't run, he said. Running just means he chases, and he knows this country better than you do. He thought for a moment. There's a man in Rawlins, name of Aldous Fitch. He's a territorial claims magistrate, handles disputes over land, labor contracts, debts. He's not a friend of mine, but he's an honest man, which out here amounts to the same thing. He crossed his arms. If your father was making payments, there's a record of it somewhere. Receipts, ledger entries from the railroad company, witness accounts from other workers. Briggs's own ledger can be challenged if we can show another version of the same numbers. And if there is no record? Lena asked. Caleb looked at her. Then we make the problem so visible that it becomes someone else's problem too. Maylin tilted her head slightly. Meaning? Meaning Briggs operates because nobody's looking at him directly, Caleb said. Men like him depend on the dark. You put them in the open, sometimes they find they don't like the light as much as they thought. He paused. I'm not saying it'll be easy or fast. I'm saying it's the path that doesn't end with you running forever. The sisters exchanged one of their wordless conversations. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. "All right," Lena said. It was Caleb had come to understand in the 8 days he'd known her, the closest Lena came to fully committing to something. "All right," in her mouth, meant she had considered every angle and decided to proceed. It was not a small thing. That night he wrote a letter to Aldous Fitch and Rollins, setting out the situation in plain, factual language. Debts claimed without documentation. Labor under coercion. A foreman who had presented himself with armed companions at a private property. He didn't embellish, and he didn't editorialize. He knew Fitch well enough to know that plain language went further than passionate argument. He sealed it and set it on the table to go with the next rider heading south. He was blowing out the lamp when Lena spoke from the darkness near the fireplace, where she had been sitting so quietly he'd half forgotten her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Caleb stopped. Thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. "Because it's right," he said. "That is not enough for most people," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact, stated with the even certainty of someone who had accumulated evidence. "No," he agreed. "It's not." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 4 years in a war that was supposed to be about what was right, watched a lot of men die for it, watched some other men do the opposite and come out fine." He paused. "I've decided that's their problem. What I do, that's mine." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, an owl moved through the dark. "My father said something like that," Lena said softly. "He said a man's choices are the only things that truly belong to him." "Smart man," Caleb said. "Yes," Lena said. "He was." He went to bed. He lay in the dark near the fireplace and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling around him, the breathing of other lives above in the loft, the river in the distance. He thought about Wei Chen, who had borrowed $40 because he loved his daughters and had been repaid for it with death and exploitation and a number in a ledger that grew instead of shrank. He thought about the kind of world that allowed men like Briggs to exist and operate with the casual confidence of someone who has never been seriously inconvenienced. Then he stopped thinking about it because that particular line of thought went nowhere useful and went to sleep. The next several days passed in a kind of suspended tension, the particular quality of calm that exists when everyone involved knows the calm is borrowed. Caleb sent the letter to Rollins with a trapper named Cord Haskins, who passed through every 2 weeks on his way south, a reliable man who asked no questions and delivered what he carried. Then he settled in to wait. In the waiting, the shape of their shared days refined itself further. He taught the sisters how to shoot. This was not chivalry, Caleb was not built for chivalry, but practicality. The same practicality that had made him check the rifle above his door every morning since he'd built the cabin. A person who could not defend themselves was a person who depended entirely on the defense of others, and Caleb had seen too many situations where that arrangement failed catastrophically at the worst possible moment. He set up a row of tin cans on the north fence and started with the basics: stance, grip, sight alignment, the management of breath before the trigger pull. Lena approached the lesson the way she approached everything, systematically, with intense focus, treating each piece of information as something to be understood before it could be applied. By the third afternoon, she was hitting 4 out of 5 cans with the .22 carbine at 30 yards. Maylene's approach was different. She listened to the instruction, nodded at appropriate intervals, and then picked up the rifle and shot all 5 cans in sequence on her first real attempt. Caleb stared at the fence. "Did I do it wrong?" Maylene asked, with a tone that suggested she was fairly confident she had not. "No," Caleb said. "You did it exactly right." He paused. "You've held a rifle before." "Our father hunted when we lived in the mountains of Hunan province," she said. "He took us with him sometimes. I was 10 years old, but I was a better shot than my sister." She glanced sideways at Lena. "You were always taller," Lena said, with the dignified calm of someone who has lost the same argument many times and has made peace with it. "I was not taller. I had better instincts." "You had better luck." "They are the same thing." Caleb left them to that particular debate and went to put the rifle away, and found that he was smiling and that it had happened without his permission. It was on the 12th day that Maylene asked him about the war. They were in the kitchen after supper, Lena having gone to the loft early with a headache that she had mentioned once and then refused to discuss further. The lamp was lit and the wood stove was ticking with heat, and Maylene was sitting across the table from Caleb, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had somehow produced from a packet of dried herbs she carried in her bundle. One of the small provisions that spoke to how carefully she and her sister had planned their escape. "You dream," she said, "at night. We can hear you." Caleb looked at her. "I'm sorry if I woke you." "You did not wake us. I am a light sleeper." She studied him. "The sounds are not peaceful." "No," he agreed. "They're not." She waited, and he understood that she was not asking out of politeness or social routine. She was asking because she had decided she wanted to know, which was different. "The war," he said. "It was a long time ago. The dreams haven't gotten the message." "What happens in the dreams?" He considered deflecting, chose not to. "Different things. Sometimes it's specific, a particular day, a particular field. Sometimes it's just the noise, the sound of it." He paused. "Battle sounds like nothing else. You don't know that until you've heard it. Afterwards, you can't unhear it." Maylene was quiet for a moment, looking at her mug. "When we were at Briggs Camp," she said, "there was a night when two of the men started fighting over something small. A card game, I think. It became very loud, very fast, and then there was a gun." She looked up. "No one was shot, but the sound of it—" She stopped. "I still hear it sometimes, in the wrong moments." "Yes," Caleb said, "like that." "Does it get smaller?" she asked. "With time?" He thought about being honest versus being kind, and decided, as he usually did with Maylene, that she would prefer honest. "It gets further away. Some of the time. It doesn't disappear." She nodded, absorbing this with the same equanimity she seemed to bring to everything difficult. "That is good enough," she said. "Further away is good enough." He looked at her across the lamplight. "Your sister doesn't dream the same way," he said. It was an observation, not a question. "Lena contains things," Maylene said. "She puts them in a place inside herself and keeps them there. It is useful, and it costs her." A pause. "I let things move through me. It is messy, but it costs less." She tilted her head slightly. "You are more like Lena." Caleb thought about this. "Maybe," he said. "The things you keep inside," Maylene said, "they do not disappear either. They just become part of the structure of you." She tapped the table with one finger. "Like the rot in your roof beam, hidden until someone pulls back the floor." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You're a very direct person," he said. "Yes," Maylene agreed, without apology. "I'm not sure if that's a compliment yet," he said. She almost smiled. "It is not meant as one or the other. It is meant as true." He found himself without an adequate response to that, which, he was learning, was not an uncommon outcome of conversations with Maylene. 2 days later, something shifted in the air between the cabin and the road, the way air shifts before weather. Not a thing you could see, but a thing you could feel along the back of the neck. Caleb was shoeing one of his horses in the lean-to barn when the sound of the cattle changed. Not a dramatic thing, just a subtle disruption in the usual pattern of their grazing, a slight compression of movement toward the south end of the pasture. Animals notice things before men do. Caleb had learned to trust that. He set down the hoof he was working on, wiped his hands, and walked to the barn door. The road was empty. The hills were still. The afternoon was quiet in the way that sometimes precedes unquiet. He walked to the cabin and went inside. Lena was at the table, copying something from one of their father's documents. She had explained that she was trying to reconstruct from memory every payment record she could recall, every date and amount her father had mentioned, building a parallel account to present to Fitch if it came to that. She looked up when he came in. "Something wrong?" she said. "Not yet," he said. "Maybe nothing. Maybe—" He took the rifle down from the rack above the door and checked it, something he'd already done that morning, but which cost nothing to do again. "Just a feeling." Maylene appeared from the kitchen doorway. She had a flour-dusted towel in her hands, and she was looking at Caleb with that particular directness that meant she had already arrived at the same conclusion he had and was waiting to see what he would do about it. "The horses," she said. "Yes." She nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence, and went back into the kitchen. He heard the sound of the wood stove being banked, damped down, the way you damp a fire when you might need to leave quickly. It occurred to Caleb that she had done this before. Not this exact thing, but the preparation for something bad arriving. The quick, quiet securing of a space. He felt a flare of something dark and complicated on her behalf. Not pity, which she would not have welcomed, but something close to a righteous anger that this was a skill she'd been required to develop. He put that away and focused. "If men come," he said to Lena, keeping his voice low and even, "I want you both in the loft. There's a window at the back. It's a drop, but the ground's soft from the thaw. If things go wrong, you go out that window and you go north along the river toward the Henderson homestead. 3 miles. You tell them Caleb Turner sent you." Lena had set down her pen. She was watching him with clear, steady eyes. "What counts as wrong?" she said. "If I'm not standing," he said. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I will not hide in the loft while you Lena." He said it quietly. "Please." A pause. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked down at her paper. "All right," she said. They came at mid-afternoon when the shadows were starting to lean east. Briggs came with 3 men this time. He came through the fence line without stopping, through it, not around it, which told Caleb everything he needed to know about where the conversation was going to go. The boards of the fence cracked and splintered under the horse's weight, and Briggs rode up to within 20 feet of the cabin door and stopped. Caleb was standing outside. He had positioned himself deliberately, not in the doorway, where a man could be pushed back into a confined space, but in the yard, in the open, where he had room and could be seen from the road if anyone happened to pass. "Turner," Briggs said. He had the air of a man who had decided that patience had served its purpose and something more direct was required. "Last time we spoke, I was polite. I'm going to be straightforward today." "Go ahead," Caleb said. "Those 2 women are on your property. I know they are because I've spoken to a man in Rawlins who saw them with you at the trading post 2 days ago." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "They owe a debt. That debt gives me a legal claim on their labor. You harboring them puts you on the wrong side of that claim." "What man in Rawlins?" Caleb said. Briggs blinked. He had not expected that specific question. "That's not—" "What man?" Caleb said again, the same even tone, as if they were discussing grain prices. "Because if you're making a legal argument, the source of your information matters. If you've got someone in Rawlins watching who comes through the trading post and reporting back to you, that's something a territorial magistrate might find interesting." Something moved in Briggs' pale eyes. Not anger exactly, recalculation. He had expected either immediate capitulation or immediate confrontation, and Caleb was offering him neither. "I didn't come here to argue law with a rancher," Briggs said. "What did you come here to do?" Caleb said. The man to Briggs' left, the hired hand from the previous visit, the one whose hand had moved toward his gun, shifted his weight in the saddle. It was a small movement, but Caleb caught it. "I came to collect what's mine," Briggs said. "Simple as that." "People aren't yours to collect," Caleb said. "Not anymore. That was settled about 9 years ago, and it cost a great many people a great deal." He kept his eyes on Briggs. "Debt bondage is the same argument with different language. A magistrate will tell you the same thing." "A magistrate," Briggs said, and there was something thin and unpleasant in his voice, "is not here. You are." "That's true," Caleb said. A silence stretched between them, taut and specific. Briggs nodded to the man on his right, a signal so slight it was almost nothing. Almost. Caleb saw it. What happened next happened fast. The man on the right dismounted and came forward, reaching for Caleb's arm with the casual confidence of someone who has done this before and has not yet encountered serious resistance. Caleb turned at the hip and hit him once, hard, in the solar plexus. Not a wild swing, but a deliberate, measured strike that used the rotation of his body rather than the strength of his arm. The man folded and went down, wheezing. The hired hand from the previous visit had his gun out. Caleb's hand was already on the rifle. "Stop!" said Briggs loudly to both of them. Everyone stopped. Briggs looked at Caleb with something new in his expression. Not quite respect, but its practical cousin. Reassessment. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Briggs said. I generally find, Caleb said, his voice still level, the rifle still in his hand but pointed at the ground, that what you call hard is what I call correct. Briggs studied him. You're one man, he said. Today, Caleb agreed. Tomorrow I ride to Rawlins. Day after that, you've got a magistrate asking questions about your ledger books and where you send women who can't pay their debts. He paused. That trip's already set up. Letter went 2 weeks ago. This was a calculated risk, showing the card before it was played. But Caleb had judged Briggs, in the particular way that experience with dangerous men allows, as someone who was ruthless within the limits of his own comfort, a man who preferred situations he controlled. Unpredictability was not his element. Briggs was quiet for a long moment. The man on the ground had gotten to his knees, still doubled over. This isn't over, Briggs said finally. I know it's not, Caleb said. I'm not asking it to be. I'm asking you to get off my land. Another silence. Briggs looked at the cabin. His eyes moved to the upper window for just a moment, just long enough to communicate that he knew they were up there, that this mattered to him, that it was not finished. Then he turned his horse and rode back through the broken fence, and his men followed, and the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road. Caleb stood in the yard and breathed. His hands were steady. They had learned to be steady after the war, in situations like this. The adrenaline still moved through him, but quietly, like a river that had learned its banks. After a moment, he heard the loft window open. Caleb, Lena's voice from above, controlled but frayed at the edges. Fine, he said, before she could ask. Come down. They came down the loft stairs together, as they always moved together, and emerged into the main room where the afternoon light was coming through the windows at a long angle, falling across the table and the floor, and Caleb's hands where he had set the rifle back on its rack. Maylene looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not soft, exactly. Nothing about Maylene was precisely soft, but it was open in a way that her usual self-containment did not permit. You did not call for us, she said. Didn't need to, Caleb said. But you said, if things went wrong, things didn't go wrong. He turned to face them. He backed down, for now. But I meant what I told him. I need to get to Rawlins. I need to see Fitch in person. A letter isn't going to be enough if Briggs decides to come back with more men and less conversation. Lena was standing very straight, with her arms at her sides and her hands slightly curled, the posture of someone who has been frightened and is managing it with great deliberateness. You would go to Rawlins for us, she said. Not a question, something else, something trying to understand. I would go to Rawlins, Caleb said carefully, because this situation has a solution, and sitting here waiting for Briggs to bring 4 men next time instead of 3 is not that solution. He paused. I would go because what he's doing is wrong, and there is a legal path that might end it properly. He looked at her. And yes, also for you. Lena was quiet. Maylene was looking between them with an expression of frank attention, as if watching something work itself out in real time. Both things can be true, Caleb said. Yes, Lena said after a moment. I know. She took a breath. When would you go? Day after tomorrow. I need to reinforce the fence first. If he sends men while I'm gone, I want to make them work for it. He paused. You'll both stay inside and keep the rifle inside with you. The .2, 2 carbine too. You both know how to use them. We know, Maylene said. If anything happens, the river road north, 3 miles, Henderson Homestead, Maylene said. You told us. Caleb looked at her. You were listening from the kitchen. I am always listening, she said with complete calm. He almost said something, decided against it. Let it be Usha's thoughts. That evening, while Caleb was working on the fence boards by lantern light, Lena came out and stood at the edge of the circle of light with a coat over the flannel shirt and her arms crossed against the cold. She did not speak immediately. She watched him work for a while, the clean, practiced movements of a man who knew exactly how much force a job required. My father could do that, she said eventually. Work in the dark. He said he could feel where the work needed to go after enough years. She paused. He was a carpenter before the railroad. In our village. You've told me more about him in the last 2 weeks than in all the time before, Caleb said, still working. It was not the time before, Lena said. Before, we needed to be careful about what we told anyone, what we gave them to use. She was quiet for a moment. You're the first person since he died that I have not had to be careful with. Oh, Caleb stopped what he was doing and looked at her. In the lantern light, her face was difficult to read, or rather, it was readable in a way that was new, as if something that had been held behind a very controlled surface was allowing itself, briefly, to be seen. I don't take that lightly, he said. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. That is why I said it. He held her gaze for a moment. The lantern swung slightly in the breeze, sending the light moving over the grass. Lena, he said. Yes. Your father's receipts, the ones he kept. Do you know if he sent any copies anywhere? A letter home, maybe. Someone in San Francisco. She blinked at the shift. Then her eyes sharpened, the careful intelligence coming back to the surface. His brother, she said. Our uncle in San Francisco. Our father wrote to him every month. He mentioned... She stopped. He mentioned that he had been making payments to the foreman. He always listed the amounts. Those letters, Caleb said. If your uncle still has them, that's a record. Independent of Briggs, independent of the railroad company, a magistrate can subpoena letters. Lena stared at him. Can you do that? Subpoena letters? Fitch can. Or the territorial judge in Cheyenne if it goes that far. He paused. Can you write to your uncle from here? Yes. He has an address? A laundry on DuPont Street. Something was moving in her expression. Not quite hope, which she kept under careful guard, but the precursor of it. The shape hope makes before it commits to being itself. I can write tonight. Do that, Caleb said. I'll make sure Cord Haskins takes it south on his next pass. She stood there for another moment, as if there were something else she wanted to say. Then she straightened and pulled the coat tighter. Thank you, Caleb, she said, and turned and went back inside. He watched her go and then turned back to the fence and worked in the lantern light until the boards were solid and the posts were set and the perimeter of his small piece of the world was as secure as he could make it. Above him, the Wyoming stars were out in their full, indifferent abundance. Thousands of them, cold and bright and utterly uninterested in the small human arrangements being made beneath them. Caleb had stopped finding that troubling a long time ago. He had made his peace with being small in a large world. What he had not made his peace with, and was only now beginning to understand, was the possibility that being small did not necessarily mean being alone. He put out the lantern and went inside, where the fire was burning and 2 women were writing letters by its light, and the cabin held them all in its rough and particular warmth. He left for Rawlins 2 mornings later before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge. The sisters were awake when he came downstairs. Maylene had coffee ready and a portion of flatbread wrapped in cloth for the ride, and she handed both to him without ceremony, the way a person does when they have decided that practical care is the clearest language available to them. Lena stood near the door with her arms at her sides and watched him check the rifle in the scabbard and cinch the saddlebag straps. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4 if Fitch is out on circuit. I'll send word with any rider heading north if it runs longer. We will be here, Lena said. I know you will. He looked at them both. Keep the doors barred at night. The rifle stays loaded and accessible. If anyone comes to the fence line and calls for me, don't answer and don't show yourselves until you're sure of who it is. Caleb, Maylene said. Yes. We have managed difficult situations before you, she said. Not unkindly, just as fact. He looked at her for a moment. I know that too, he said. Doesn't stop me saying it. Something in her expression shifted. Something very small, very quick, that might have been the beginning of a smile if she'd let it finish. He rode south into the gray morning light and did not let himself look back, because he had found over the years that looking back at the things you were leaving had a particular cost that wasn't worth paying. The ride to Rawlins was a full day's journey under good conditions, and the conditions were merely adequate. The road south was still soft from the thaw, the horse picking through the mud with the careful irritation of an animal that has opinions about the quality of the ground beneath its feet. Caleb rode without hurrying, using the time the way long solitary rides always allowed him to use it, turning things over in his mind, examining them from different angles, arriving at conclusions that the noise of daily life had prevented him from reaching. He thought about what Lena had said at the fence 2 nights ago. The first person since he died that I have not had to be careful with. He had been carrying those words at a slight distance, the way you carry something fragile, aware of its weight without pressing on it. Now, with the miles opening up around him and no particular demands on his attention, he let himself consider them more directly. He understood, from his own experience, what it cost to be perpetually careful. The constant low-level expenditure of energy that vigilance required, watching the tone of every interaction for signs of threat or deceit, measuring out trust in the smallest possible increments, never letting the guard down fully because the last time you had, something had been taken. He had lived that way since the war. He still lived that way to some extent, which was part of why solitude had seemed not just bearable, but preferable to the alternative. What he had not expected when he'd pulled 2 strangers from a flooding river 3 weeks ago was that their presence in his house would feel like a reduction of vigilance rather than an increase. He filed that observation away without drawing any conclusions from it and rode on toward Rawlins. Aldous Fitch was, as Caleb had characterized him to the sisters, not a friend. He was something more useful than a friend in situations like this one. A man of rigorous principle and minimal sentiment, who had come to the Wyoming Territory 8 years ago from Philadelphia with a law education and a conviction that the frontier needed the same structures of legal accountability that the settled East had developed, imperfectly but meaningfully, over 2 centuries. He was 60 years old, thin as a fence rail, with white hair and eyes so dark they looked black in most lighting. He conducted his office from a single-room building on the east side of Rawlins that smelled permanently of paper and lamp oil. He read Caleb's letter again after Caleb arrived, read it carefully, in the particular way lawyers read things, which is not for the information but for what the information implies. "Briggs," he said when he was finished. "Abraham Briggs." "You know him," Caleb said. "I know of him." Fitch set the letter down with precise care. "He's been running labor contracts for the mountain railroad crews for 4 years. There have been 2 previous complaints lodged with this office regarding his methods. Both times the complainants withdrew before the matter could be examined." He looked at Caleb with those dark eyes. "The first complainant left the territory. The second one, I was told he had an accident." "An accident," Caleb said. "The word was used," Fitch said dryly. "I was skeptical at the time. I am more skeptical now." "What can you do?" Fitch was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant he was running through options and their attendant complications. "The debt claim is the mechanism," he said. "If the debt is fraudulent and inflated figures applied posthumously to the surviving family of a deceased worker, without their agreement and without documentation of the original terms, would meet the legal definition of fraudulent in most territorial courts. Then the claim on the women's labor dissolves with it." He paused. "The challenge is documentation. Briggs will have a ledger. He will say it's accurate. Without a counter record, it becomes the word of 2 Chinese women against a white foreman with 4 years of established business presence in the territory." "There may be a counter record," Caleb said. He laid out what Lena had told him, the letters to the uncle in San Francisco, the monthly amounts their father had reported sending, the potential paper trail through a laundry on DuPont Street. Fitch listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the magistrate steepled his fingers and looked at the ceiling. "Letters from a family member in California are hearsay in a strict evidentiary sense," he said. "But in a territorial proceeding, a magistrate has considerably more latitude than a circuit court judge. I can treat them as supporting evidence for a pattern of payment." He brought his gaze back down to Caleb. "I can also examine the railroad company's own labor records. If Weichen was employed under a contract, there should be documentation of the terms, including any advance of funds and the repayment schedule. If Briggs' ledger shows a different amount than the original contract, that's not ambiguity. That's a falsified document. Can you compel the railroad company to produce those records?" "I can issue a formal request. Whether they respond promptly or at all is a different matter. The railroad companies have their own legal machinery, and they do not particularly enjoy yielding to territorial officials." He paused. But I can make a good deal of noise about what I'm looking for and why, which tends to motivate compliance. A thin, dry, almost smile. Bad publicity is a language even the railroads speak. Caleb leaned forward. How long? To do it properly, 6 to 8 weeks? And in the meantime? Fitch looked at him steadily. In the meantime, Briggs cannot legally compel the return of the women if they are present on private property and have not been served a valid court order. And I can ensure that no such order is issued from this office without full examination of the debt claim first. He paused. That does not prevent him from taking extra-legal action. No, Caleb agreed. It doesn't. Are you prepared for that? Caleb thought about the broken fence boards. About the particular look in Briggs' pale eyes when he turned his horse and left. About the flat assessment Fitch had just offered regarding the man's previous accidents. I've been prepared for things like that before, he said. Fitch nodded once, the nod of a man who accepts this answer without requiring elaboration. I'll begin the documentation process immediately. I'll also draft a formal notice to Briggs informing him that the debt claim is under magistrate review and that any attempt to compel compliance during the review period will be treated as obstruction. He picked up his pen. It won't stop him, but it will make whatever he does next considerably more legally costly for him. Good enough, Caleb said, and stood. Turner. Fitch looked up from his desk. These women, are they safe where they are? As safe as I can make them, Caleb said. The magistrate held his gaze for a moment, and in that moment something passed between them that was not quite said, an acknowledgement, older than language, of the particular responsibility that falls on those who are positioned to act when others cannot. Make them safer, Fitch said, and ride back quickly. Though Caleb rode back faster than he'd come. The mud on the road had firmed up overnight, and the horse felt the change in his rider's urgency and matched it without being asked. They made it back to the property boundary before the light had fully gone from the sky, and Caleb was through the patched fence gap and dismounting at the barn before the evening star was fully visible. The cabin was lit from within, warm light in the windows. Both sisters came to the door when they heard the horse, together, as they always were, and stood in the spill of lamplight looking at him with the contained expression of people who have been managing anxiety for 3 days and have not quite put it down yet. You're back early, Lena said. The road was good. He unsaddled the horse and turned it into the pasture and came to the doorway. Fitch is moving on it. Railroad records, a formal review of the debt claim. He's sending Briggs a notice. Will it work? Maylene asked. Not fast enough to stop him entirely, Caleb said honestly. But it changes the math. Makes official extortion expensive. Men like Briggs will absorb cost up to a point. Past that point, they look for something that costs less. Lena stepped back from the door to let him in. And that point, are we near it? I don't know yet, he said, but we're moving toward it. He went inside. Maylene had supper on, a bean stew with salt pork and what appeared to be wild onion, which she had apparently found growing along the riverbank with the systematic foraging attention she brought to any environment she occupied for more than a week. Caleb sat at the table and ate without speaking for a while, letting the road tiredness drain out of his legs, and felt the particular quality of the cabin around him. The warmth, the smell of wood smoke and cooking, the two presences that had, in 3 weeks and some few days, made his house into something that felt different from the thing it had been when it was only his. He noticed this without deciding what to do with it. On the night of the 3rd day after his return, Caleb woke to a sound he had not been expecting. Not the horses. He had learned to parse the horse sounds finely, and this was something else. Something outside the barn, low and intermittent, with a regularity that did not belong to any animal pattern he recognized. He was dressed and out the door in 90 seconds, moving quietly through the dark. The moon was up and nearly full, which was both helpful and unhelpful, good enough to see by, bright enough to be seen. He went around the south side of the cabin and stopped. There were 3 of them, on foot, moving along the far fence line toward the barn. They had tied their horses a distance back, which was why he hadn't heard the hoofbeats. They were carrying something. He couldn't make out the specifics in the moonlight, but the shapes were wrong for men who were simply approaching a property to talk. One of them had what looked like a lantern, unlit. Another carried a length of chain. Caleb felt the cold, specific anger of a man whose property is being threatened. Not the hot anger of offense, but the cold, deliberate kind that sharpens rather than blinds. He went back to the cabin. Fast, but quiet. He did not go inside. Instead, he went to the corner of the cabin wall and set himself there, where he had the wall at his back and a clear line of sight to the barn and the approach from the south fence. "Caleb," Mayleen's voice from the loft window. Not loud, barely above a murmur. He looked up. She was leaning out, her face pale in the moonlight. She had the .22 carbine. "3 men," he murmured up to her. "South fence, moving toward the barn. I think they mean to burn it." A pause. "How do you want to do this?" He had never thought of himself as a man who would be grateful for the question phrased precisely that way, as a tactical question, not a frightened one, not a plea for reassurance, but a genuine request for operational coordination. He was grateful for it now. "Cover the south approach," he murmured. "Don't fire unless I tell you, or unless one of them gets past me. I'm going to let them know they've been seen." "And Lena?" "Get her back from the window. Tell her to be ready to move if she hears me tell her to go." A moment, and then the faint sound of whispered Chinese. Then, "She says she won't." Caleb almost said something about this, decided it could wait. He moved along the cabin wall and came around the south corner and called out across the yard in a clear, carrying voice. "I see all 3 of you. Set down what you're carrying and step back to the fence." The 3 figures froze. The one with the unlit lantern turned toward the sound of his voice. For a moment, nothing moved, and the Wyoming night sat around them all, enormous and indifferent and lit up silver by the moon. Then the one with the chain started moving, not toward the fence as instructed, but at an angle toward Caleb's position, and he had something in his other hand that caught the moonlight in a way that chains did not. Caleb fired into the ground 3 feet to the man's left. The sound of the rifle in the night silence was seismic. The man jumped back 2 full feet. The one with the lantern broke for the fence immediately and went over it and kept running, which told Caleb something about his particular level of commitment to the enterprise. The third one, who had been standing back, who had not been carrying anything visible, was already moving for the fence by the time the echo of the shot had finished. The man with the chain was still standing. Caleb levered another round into the chamber. "Last chance to be smart," he said. A long, suspended moment, and then the man dropped the chain in the dirt and turned and walked, not ran, which Caleb supposed was some gesture toward dignity, to the fence and over it and into the dark. Caleb stayed at the corner of the cabin until he heard horses moving away to the south. Then he stayed for another 5 minutes, because men who retreat sometimes stop retreating and sometimes don't make as much noise as they think they do. When he was satisfied, he went inside. Lena was at the foot of the loft stairs, fully dressed, the rifle he'd given her held at her side. Her face in the lamplight was controlled. He was learning to look past the control, to the smaller signs underneath, the set of her jaw, the slight tension around her eyes, the way her breathing was slightly faster than usual. "It's done," he said. "They're gone." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "Are you hurt?" "No." She let out a breath that was not quite steady. "Good," she said, and went back up the stairs. Maylene came in through the front door a moment later with the carbine over her arm, having apparently come down from the loft by the external route to confirm the fence line was clear. She was, Caleb noted, barefoot in the dirt and did not appear to have noticed. "They were Briggs men?" she asked. "I'd bet on it." "They came to burn the barn." "That was the plan," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then she looked up at him, and in her expression was something he had not seen on her face before. Not fear, not calculation, but something rawer than either. Something that had to do with what it meant to have someone stand between you and the fire. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him for long enough to be deliberate. Then she went to the wood stove and put the kettle on, because Maylene, in moments of high feeling, cooked things, and Caleb had learned to find this as comforting as she apparently intended it. He rode the fence line at dawn and found where they had tied their horses. 3 sets of tracks, and in the trampled ground near the fence post, the drop chain and a small glass bottle that had, when uncorked, the unmistakable smell of coal oil. Confirmation, if he'd needed it. He brought the bottle back to the cabin and set it on the table where both sisters could see it. Neither of them commented. Neither of them needed to. The chain of events from that night onward moved with the particular compressed momentum of situations that have passed the point of resolution by waiting and now must be resolved by other means. Caleb wrote again to Fitch, describing the attempt, the men, the chain, the coal oil, and sent it south with a cattle driver passing through. He also sent a shorter note to a man named Reardon in the territorial sheriff's office in Cheyenne, someone he had done a service for years ago involving a stolen cattle herd and a false bill of sale. The service had never been repaid in kind, and Caleb had not asked for repayment because he had not expected to need it. Now he needed it. While they waited, the tension in the cabin was a different quality than before. Before Caleb's trip to Rawlins, it had been the tension of uncertainty, not knowing when the next confrontation would come or what shape it would take. Now it was the tension of known approach. Briggs had escalated, had shown his method, had been turned back once, and would calculate carefully before coming again. But he would come again. This was no longer a question anyone was asking. What changed in the interim? And Caleb would think about this later, in the quieter time that came after, and understand it as the period when the thing between them shifted from what it had been into what it would be, was the quality of the evenings. They had stopped being careful with each other. Not reckless, none of the three of them were built for recklessness, but the particular careful of strangers had given way to something else, something that had no good name, but that everyone who has shared hard circumstances with other people will recognize. It was the ease of the known, the ability to be in a room with another person and be exactly what you were, without the expenditure of energy that performance required. Caleb found himself telling them things he had not told anyone. Not because he decided to, but because the evenings created their own gravity, and his usual self-containment had apparently, without consulting him, relaxed its grip. He told them about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and who had been, he said, the only person who had ever made him feel that his particular quietness was not a deficit, but a quality. He told them about the farm in Kentucky that he and Daniel had grown up on, the specific smell of it in summer, clover and red clay, and the creek that ran south of the property. He told them about the day he'd decided not to go back to Kentucky after the war, standing at a crossroads in Missouri with no particular reason to go one direction over the other, and how he'd turned west because west was the direction in which nobody knew him. Lena listened the way she always listened, with the total, focused attention of someone who understands that listening is a form of respect. She asked questions, the careful, precise questions that led a story deeper rather than sideways. She was, he realized, genuinely curious about him, not as a subject of study, but as a person, as someone whose interior life she wanted to understand. Maylene listened differently. She sat with her knees up or with her legs tucked under her, close to the fire, and she didn't ask questions but occasionally made observations that were so accurate they felt like small intrusions into his private thoughts. She had the unsettling quality of some people, the quality of simply seeing, without apparent effort, the thing that was actually there, rather than the thing being presented. One evening she said without preamble, "You are not a man who gave up on people. You are a man who decided that people were not safe." He looked at her. "That's a different thing," he said. "Very different," she agreed. "Giving up is an ending. What you did is a waiting." She looked at the fire. "You have been waiting for it to be safe again." He did not have an answer for that. He sat with it, the way you sit with something that is precisely true and that you have not let yourself know until someone else said it. Lena, from across the room, was watching them both with an expression that was layered in the particular way Lena's expressions were layered. The top of it, the immediate surface, was warmth. Underneath it, something more careful. Underneath that, something that she was perhaps only beginning to look at herself. The third confrontation came on a Tuesday, 13 days after the barn attempt, in the early afternoon when the light was still high and honest in the sky. Caleb heard them on the road before he saw them. Not two riders this time, not three on foot in the dark, but a full approach. 4 horses moving at a deliberate pace, no attempt at concealment, coming up the main road in broad daylight with the confidence of men who have decided that subtlety has not served them. He was at the woodpile when he heard it. He set the axe against the cabin wall, went inside, and told the sisters. "In the loft," he said. "Now, no argument." Malin picked up the cast iron skillet from the kitchen stove, not as a weapon, Caleb assumed, but from some reflex of not knowing what to take, and went up the stairs. Lena followed her. Caleb took his rifle, checked it, loaded his coat pockets with extra rounds, and walked out to meet them. Briggs came through the fence against us, through the repaired fence, splintering the new boards, which Caleb suspected was intentional. He had 4 men with him this time, 2 of them carrying rifles laid across their saddle bows with casual visibility. The message was clear as a telegram. "Turner," Briggs said. He looked tired, Caleb thought. Not physically, but in the particular way of a man who has decided he is done with complicated approaches and wants this concluded. "This is the last time I come politely." "You've never come politely," Caleb said. "I've come without doing what I'm capable of doing," Briggs said. "Which is as close to polite as you're going to get from me." He stopped his horse 10 feet out. "Send the women out. We take them, we go. Your property stays standing. Simple." "Not going to happen," Caleb said. Briggs nodded as if this confirmed something he had expected. He looked at the 2 men with rifles. They looked back. What happened next was fast and ugly in the way that real violence always is. Not the choreographed efficiency of men who have planned, but the brutal, improvised chaos of men who have committed. The man on Briggs' left dismounted and came at Caleb directly, and Caleb moved to meet him rather than retreating, which disrupted the timing the man had planned for. He had expected ground to close, not the target coming toward him, and the surprise cost him half a second. Caleb used the half second. He drove his elbow into the man's jaw and used the momentum to put the rifle between himself and the second man who was coming from the right. But there were 4 of them, and Caleb was 1 man, and mathematics did not care about determination. The third man hit him from the side, a tackle rather than a blow, driving him off his feet and into the dirt. Caleb twisted as he went down, kept hold of the rifle, came up to 1 knee. He had a moment of clear space and used it to fire a shot that took the rifle out of the mounted man's saddle scabbard. Not the man, the scabbard, a piece of shooting that required more luck than he usually counted on, and the mounted man's horse spooked and went sideways and took 30 seconds out of the mounted man's participation. But the tackle had opened something along his left side. He felt it before he understood what it was, a hot spreading sensation between his ribs that he knew from experience was not a bruise. The man who had tackled him had a knife and had used it on the way down. Caleb registered this fact the way a man registers a fact in a fight, noted and filed and dealt with later, because stopping now to attend to it was not an option. He got to his feet. He was aware of Briggs watching from horseback, not participating, which was consistent with everything he understood about Briggs. A man who directed rather than did, who preferred to let hired effort absorb the risk of the immediate. The man with the knife was coming back. The man whose jaw Caleb had hit with his elbow was back on his feet, slower but present. The 2 of them together was more than Caleb, with the blood now making itself known through his shirt, was going to be able to manage for much longer. He was thinking, clearly and without particular panic, that he had perhaps 30 seconds before his legs decided they were done, when the sound came from the cabin doorway. A crash. Loud. Metallic. Then a sound that was unambiguous to anyone who knew it, the solid, resonant impact of cast iron against the side of a human skull. Maylene had come out of the cabin. She had not come down the loft stairs and out the front door as instructed. She had come out the loft window at the back, dropped to the soft ground below, come around the south wall of the cabin, and arrived behind the man with the knife at the precise moment when his attention was entirely forward. The cast iron skillet connected with the side of his head with a sound that Caleb would remember for a long time, final and conclusive, like the last word in an argument that was not going to be reopened. The man with the knife went down and did not immediately get up. The man whose jaw Caleb had elbowed stopped moving. He looked at Maylene. He looked at the skillet. He appeared to revise his assessment of the situation. Briggs from horseback looked at Maylene. His expression was the expression of a man who has encountered a variable he did not account for in his calculations. From the loft window, clearly having refused to go anywhere, Lena leveled the carbine at Briggs with a steadiness that would have impressed Caleb under different circumstances. "I will shoot your horse out from under you if you move," she said, in the same careful, precise English she used for everything. "I am an accurate shot. Please do not require me to prove it." The mounted man whose scabbard Caleb had destroyed had gotten his horse back under control and was looking between Lena and Maylene and Caleb with the expression of someone rapidly recalculating his professional choices. Briggs looked at Caleb. Caleb was still on his feet, which was costing him, and they both knew it. But he was on his feet. "This is not over," Briggs said. The same words he had used before, but with a different quality now. Before, they had been a threat, confident and prescriptive. Now they sounded like something a man says when he is leaving because he has run out of other options and needs to say something on the way out. "Get off my land," Caleb said. His voice was steady. The rest of him was not. Briggs turned his horse. The remaining men followed, one dragging the man Maylene had put down, who was moving again but not in any condition to make decisions. They went through the broken fence and onto the road and moved south, and Caleb watched them until they were around the bend and out of sight. Then his legs finished their negotiation with gravity, and he went to one knee in the dirt. Maylene was beside him before he had completed the fall. He felt her hands on his arm, then on his side, pressing firm and direct against the wound, and heard her say something in rapid Chinese toward the cabin, and heard Lena responding from above, and then the sound of Lena coming down from the loft, fast. "How bad?" Maylene said. Not a question, an instruction. "Not deep," he said. "I think not deep." "You think," she said. Her voice was even, but her hands were pressing hard, and he could feel that her fingers were not entirely steady. "I've had worse," he said. "That is not the reassurance you think it is," she said, and looked up at him. And what was in her eyes in that moment was not steadiness or assessment or the practical management of the immediate. It was something unconstrained and direct that she did not try to contain. And Caleb, who had spent 6 years in a cabin in Wyoming practicing the art of not needing people, looked back at her and felt something in the interior architecture of himself quietly and permanently shift. Lena arrived and knelt on his other side, and between the two of them they got him to his feet and through the cabin door, and the Wyoming afternoon went on around them. The hawks on the thermal above the ridge, the river in the distance, the mountains unchanged and enormous against the sky, indifferent as always to the small and determined human arrangements being made in their shadow. The knife had gone in at an angle between the fourth and fifth ribs on his left side, deep enough to matter, but not deep enough to reach anything that would have ended the conversation permanently. This was Maylene's assessment, delivered with clinical precision after she had cut away his shirt and examined the wound by lamplight, while Lena boiled water on the wood stove and tore a clean flour sack into strips with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to be doing something specific, or she was going to stop being able to hold herself together. "It missed the lung," Maylene said. She was pressing a folded cloth against the wound with both hands, and she did not look up when she said it. "The bleeding is steady but not fast. That is good." "I know it missed the lung," Caleb said. "I'd know if it hadn't." "Yes," she said. "You would be a different color." She finally looked up at him. He was sitting on the table. She had put him on the table because the chairs had no back support and she needed him upright. "This will need to be closed. Do you have a needle and thread?" Sewing kit in the trunk under the loft stairs. Lena was already moving. What followed was not pleasant, but Caleb had experienced enough field medicine during the war to know that unpleasant was considerably better than the alternative, and he sat on the table with his jaw set and his hands flat on his thighs and let Maylene do what needed to be done. She worked with a concentration that excluded everything else. The lamplight, the sound of the fire, the fact that her hands had been shaking 20 minutes ago. Whatever had been unconstrained in her face when he'd gone to his knee in the yard was gone now, replaced by the focused precision of someone who had decided that competence was the most useful thing she could offer. She was very good at it, better than any field surgeon he'd encountered who hadn't specifically trained for the work. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, because the question was genuine and because talking made the whole enterprise more manageable. "Our aunt in San Francisco," she said, without looking up from the needle. "She was a midwife. When we lived in her house, she taught me things. She said a woman who can manage blood is a woman who can manage most things." A pause. "Hold still." He held still. Lena reappeared from the kitchen with more hot water and set it close without speaking, and took up a position near the lamp where she could see clearly and hand things as needed. And the three of them worked through the next half hour in a tight, wordless efficiency that felt like something practiced rather than improvised. When it was done, stitched and wrapped and bound with the torn flour sack, Maylene stepped back and looked at her work with the critical eye of a person who applies standards regardless of circumstance. "It will scar," she said. "I have others," Caleb said. She looked at him with those level, dark eyes. "I know," she said. "I have seen them," and turned to wash her hands before he could decide how to respond to that. But the fever came on the second day. It was not a surprise. A knife wound in a man who had been working in cold mud in animal yards for a month was not a wound that healed without protest, but the speed of it was. By the morning of the second day after the fight, Caleb's temperature had climbed to somewhere that made coherent conversation intermittent and the rest of the world unreliable around the edges. He drifted in and out of the spaces between waking and sleep, aware enough to know where he was, but not always sure of when. The sisters moved the sleeping arrangements without discussion. There was no question of leaving him in the loft. The stairs were not manageable in his current state, and so they made a bed of sorts near the fireplace from the loft mattress and extra blankets, and one of them was always in the main room when the other slept, keeping the fire at the level that Maylene had calculated was correct for a fever that needed to be managed rather than fought. Caleb was aware of them in the way that a man is aware of things when the normal barriers between interior and exterior are softened by illness, not with his usual guarded attention, but with something more direct and unfiltered. He heard them speak to each other in Chinese during the hours when they thought he was sleeping, the sound of it a low, continuous texture in the room, not intrusive but present, like water moving over stone. He did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. The particular cadence of two people who have shared everything and whose communication is as much about what they don't say as what they do. At some point, he was not sure of the hour. The light through the windows was the gray-white of early morning. He woke to find Lena sitting near him on a low stool, a book open in her lap. He watched her for a moment before she noticed he was watching. She was not reading. Her eyes were on the page but unfocused, somewhere else entirely. Her face, in the unguarded moment of thinking herself unobserved, held something that her daytime expression kept carefully contained. Tiredness, yes, but something else. A sorrow that was old and specific, and that she managed so consistently that it rarely surfaced. "Lena," he said. She looked up immediately, the containment coming back in the fraction of a second it took her to reorient. "You're awake. How do you feel?" "Warmer than yesterday," he said, which was true in both the positive and negative sense. "What are you reading?" She looked down at the book as if she'd forgotten she was holding it. "Your Bible," she said. "I wasn't reading it I was just looking at your father's handwriting." She paused. "Is that all right?" He blinked. "My father's handwriting." "In the margins." He made notes. She turned the book so he could see the page. Small, cramped handwriting in the margins. The pencil faded, but still legible. He wrote about planting, mostly, which passages he read at which seasons. "There's one here," she turned a few pages, "where he's noted the date of his first frost 3 years running." Caleb stared at the page. He had not opened that Bible in 4 years. He had not known, or had not remembered, that his father had written in it. "My father's name was in the front," Lena said quietly. "James Turner. And below it, Daniel Turner. And below that, your name." She closed the book gently and set it on the floor beside her. "They gave it to you." "When Daniel died," Caleb said, "my mother sent it west with some of his things." A silence. The fire shifted and settled. "You have lost a great many people," Lena said. Not with pity. She was incapable of pity in the diminishing sense, but with a plainness that acknowledged it without flinching from it. "Some," he said. "And yet you are not a man who has closed himself off from," she paused, choosing the word, "from the possibility of more loss. You are a man who has closed himself off from the world, which is a different thing." She looked at him steadily. "If you had closed yourself off from loss, you would not have gone into that river." He looked at her. His head was heavy with the fever, and his thoughts were slower than usual, but this arrived clearly enough. "I didn't think about it," he said. "I just went." "Yes," she said. "That is what I mean." On the third day, the fever broke. It broke in the early hours of the morning the way fevers do. Sweating and sudden, the body deciding all at once that it was finished with the argument and releasing the heat in a rush that soaked through every layer of the bedding and left Caleb flat on his back, looking at the ceiling with the wrung-out, clarified feeling of someone who has come through something. Maylene appeared almost immediately, as if she had been listening for the specific quality of silence that follows a fever's end. She helped him out of the wet bedding with brisk, unsentimental efficiency, brought dry blankets and fresh water and something hot that she had apparently kept at the back of the stove through the night in anticipation of exactly this moment. "Drink this," she said, handing him the cup. He drank it. It was something herbal and bitter and very hot, and it went through him like a rope being pulled straight. "What is that?" he asked. "Something my aunt taught me," she said. "Ginger root and dried willow bark. Good for after fever." She was checking the wound dressing with practiced hands, not looking at his face. "The stitches held. There's no sign of rot. You were fortunate." "I was fortunate in more than one respect," he said. She stilled for just a moment, then resumed checking the dressing. "The stitches held," she repeated, as if this were the whole of what needed to be said. He let her have that. He was learning, in the slow and specific way that illness teaches you things by removing the usual defenses, that Maylene expressed herself most clearly through what she did not say and through what her hands did while she was not saying it. The steadiness of those hands now against the binding on his ribs was a sentence of its own. "Maylene," he said. "Yes. Thank you for what you did with the skillet." She finished adjusting the bandage and stood and looked at him directly. Her expression was the most open he had seen it. Not soft exactly, because openness and softness were not the same thing, and Maylene knew the difference, but honest in a way that felt deliberate, as if she had decided to let him see rather than to continue managing what he saw. "You stood between us and them," she said, "every time, without being asked and without condition." She paused. "I did what needed to be done, as did you. It wasn't the same thing." "No," she agreed. It was not the same thing. She held his gaze for a long, specific moment. "Rest now," she said, and went back to the kitchen, where the sound of her moving around the stove was, in itself, a kind of steadiness he had not known he needed. The weeks that followed were the longest Caleb could remember, and also, in a way he hadn't expected, among the most inhabited. He had been injured before, a grazing wound at Stones River, a broken arm from a horse fall in his third winter on the property. And he had managed those recoveries alone, which was simply what alone meant, the complete responsibility for your own restoration, nothing more. This was different in ways that he found himself examining with a careful, slightly bewildered attention. The sisters cooked. They cleaned and maintained the fire and the water supply and the animal feeding with a thoroughness that left him nothing to fret about in the hours when he was awake and horizontal, and consequently prone to fretting. They checked his wound with a schedule and a precision that left no room for the infection to establish itself without being immediately confronted. They were, in the specific sense of the word, competent in the way that people are when they have been required to be, when no one was going to do the thing if they didn't. But they also talked to him. Not constantly. None of the three of them was built for constant conversation, but in the natural rhythm of shared days, which found its own level without being managed. Lena brought her reconstruction project to the main room, spreading her recreated payment records across a corner of the table and working through them in the morning hours with methodical focus. And she would occasionally read aloud a date or a figure she was uncertain of and ask if he remembered anything from his conversation with Fitch that might help confirm it. It was practical. It was also, Caleb understood, a way of keeping him present in the work, of not letting him recede into the category of invalid while the real business continued without him. Maylene was less subtle about it. She simply sat near him in the afternoons and talked, sometimes about things of consequence, sometimes about nothing at all, a quality of conversation that Caleb, who had always assumed he preferred silence, discovered he did not actually prefer over the right kind of talking. She told him about Hunan province, the specific mountains of it, the terraced rice fields that climbed the hillsides like stairs built by someone with very long patience, the particular quality of the mist in the valleys in the early morning. She told him about their village, which was small and poor, and bounded by the same mountains in every direction, and about how their father had described America to them when they were children. Not as a place of streets paved with gold, as some men told it, but as a place of scale. Enormous scale. More space than a person could comprehend. He was right about that part, Maylene said, looking out the window at the mountains. Were the other parts right? Caleb asked. She considered it seriously. Some, she said. There is opportunity. It exists. But it is not where they told us it was, and it does not come to you. You have to get very close to it, and sometimes get hurt reaching for it. She paused. Like most things worth having. Your father believed in it anyway, Caleb said. The opportunity. Yes. Even after the railroad, even after the debt and Briggs and all of it, he wrote to our uncle that he believed it was still possible. 2 weeks before he died. She was quiet for a moment. Lena and I argued about that letter. She thought it was denial. I thought it was faith. She looked at him. I still think it was faith, not foolishness. Something chosen. Maybe they're the same sometimes, Caleb said. Maybe, Maylene said, but I think the choosing matters. Foolishness doesn't choose. It just is. Faith is something you decide to do even when the evidence is not fully in your favor. She tilted her head slightly. You did that. When you went into the river. I told you, I didn't think about it. You didn't think about it because you had already decided, at some level below thinking, what kind of man you were going to be. She looked at him with that direct, undeflectable gaze. That is not foolishness. That is something decided a long time ago and just enacted. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the spring was deepening. The snow was fully gone from the lower elevations, the grass coming in green and urgent along the riverbank, the kind of growth that happened fast in high country when the conditions finally aligned. You're a philosopher, he said. I'm a woman who grew up with very little to do in the evenings except think, she said. The result is similar. On the 9th day, a letter arrived with Cord Haskins on his northward pass. It was from Fitch, and it was longer than Caleb had expected. Lena read it aloud because Caleb's left arm was still stiff, and holding paper at reading distance was more complicated than it should have been. She read it in her careful, precise English, without inflection, the way she read everything, letting the information carry its own weight without editorial assistance. Fitch had obtained the original labor contract between Wei Chen and the Mountain Railroad Company, the Crestline Pacific Territorial Extension, a subsidiary that Caleb had never heard of, which in itself told him something about the layers of organization designed to insulate the larger enterprise from its smaller inconveniences. The contract showed a loan of $42, consistent with what Lena had described, with a repayment schedule of $3 per month deducted from Wei Chen's wages. Fitch had cross-referenced this against the company's own payroll records, which showed that the deductions had in fact been made and recorded. $27 of the $42 had been repaid at the time of Wei Chen's death. The remaining $15 at the contractual repayment rate would have been cleared within 6 months. Briggs' ledger, which Fitch had managed to obtain a copy of through a contact in the Territorial Surveyor's Office, who had been present when Briggs had filed a labor claim on a different matter the previous year, showed a balance of $212 with no record of any payments made. Fitch had used the word fraudulent in his letter 3 times, which was more emotional language than Caleb had expected from him, and suggested that even Fitch's considerable professional composure had limits when confronted with sufficiently clear evidence. He was filing formal charges with the territorial court in Cheyenne. He had also contacted, at Caleb's suggestion, a man named Riordan in the sheriff's office, who had apparently taken one look at the documentation and immediately dispatched 2 deputies north toward the railroad camps, with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had been wanting a good reason to look at Briggs's operation for some time. The letter ended. I expect the legal proceeding to resolve within 45 days. I would advise the subjects of the debt claim to remain where they are. The attempted arson and the assault on your person have been noted as separate criminal matters and will be addressed accordingly. A. Fitch. Lena set the letter down. The 3 of them were quiet for a moment, then Maylene said very quietly he used the word subjects. He's a lawyer, Caleb said. Everything is a subject of something. No, Maylene said. He said the subjects of the debt claim. not the women or the Chinese girls or any of the other things people say. She paused. He said subjects, like people in a legal proceeding who have standing. She looked at the letter on the table. It matters. Lena was looking at the letter too, and her face had done something that Caleb had not seen it do before. The containment had not failed exactly, but something had gotten through it. Something was visible that she did not immediately close back down. Her eyes were bright in the lamplight, and she was very still. And she did not speak for long enough that the silence became a presence in the room. Then she said, "My father was right." Her voice was entirely steady. He was right that it existed. Neither Caleb nor Maylene said anything. There was nothing to add. But the days after Fitch's letter had a different quality. Not easier, because Briggs was still somewhere to the south, and the legal proceeding was 45 days away, and anything could happen in 45 days, but oriented, purposeful. The particular quality of calm that settles on people who have been waiting without knowing what they're waiting for, and have now been given a direction. Caleb's wound was closing cleanly. He was on his feet by the 12th day, over Maylene's moderately voiced objections, and doing light work by the 14th. He did not push it, partly because he was not entirely stupid about his own body, and partly because Maylene's objections, while moderate, were delivered with a consistency and a specificity of medical detail that made them difficult to dismiss. On the 15th day, a response arrived from San Francisco. From the uncle? From Huang Bo, their father's brother, who had apparently kept every letter Wei Chen had ever sent him in a cedar box under his bed. He had found 17 letters mentioning payment amounts to the foreman. He had found 3 letters that mentioned Briggs by name. He had found 1 letter, written 4 months before Wei Chen's death, that described the foreman's method of calculation and his father's growing suspicion that the numbers in the company ledger did not match what he was being told. The uncle had copies made at a law office on Kearney Street and sent them north with a courier he paid out of his own pocket. Because, his letter said in the formal, precise Chinese that Lina translated aloud with a voice that did not entirely stay level throughout, a man who would not spend money to protect his brother's daughters was not a man worth keeping the name of. Maylene, when Lena finished translating, sat very straight and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked at Caleb and said, "Our uncle is a good man." "He sounds like one," Caleb said. "He is difficult and opinionated, and he argued with our father constantly about everything," she said. "And he is a good man." She paused. "The two are not mutually exclusive." "I've noticed that," Caleb said. She looked at him. "Are you referring to me?" "I wouldn't do that," he said. A beat. "You are absolutely referring to me," she said. "You're an excellent diagnostician and a fine cook, and you hit a man with a skillet hard enough to end his participation in the proceedings," he said. "The opinionated part is just context." Maylene looked at him for a long, assessing moment. "You are funnier than you seem," she said. "I've been told," he said, "that I seem very serious." "You are very serious," she said, "and also occasionally funny. The combination is unusual." Lena, who had been watching this exchange with a look that balanced amusement and something more complicated, set down the letter and said, to no one in particular, "I am going to make tea," and went to the kitchen. Caleb looked at the door she had gone through. Then he looked at Maylene. Something had shifted in the room in the last 30 seconds, and he was not entirely sure who had moved it. Maylene met his eyes without looking away. She held the look for a moment, direct and undefended, the full force of her attention, which was considerable. Then she looked down at the uncle's letter and smoothed the edge of it with one finger. "Lena was very frightened," she said, quietly. "When you were hurt." She was frightened in the way she gets frightened. Very still, very controlled, doing the right things in the right order, and behind all of it completely terrified. She paused. "She would not tell you that herself." "I know," Caleb said. "She is particular," Maylene said, choosing the word carefully. "She does not give things easily, but what she gives completely." She looked up at him. "I am telling you this because you are a man who might not notice unless someone told him directly." He held her gaze. "And you?" he said. "Are you particular?" She considered it with genuine seriousness. "I am different," she said. "I say what I mean." What I mean is usually clear. But what I feel, she paused. What I feel is sometimes large, and I do not always know what to do with large things. The fire crackled. The river moved in the distance. From the kitchen came the sound of Lena putting the kettle on, the particular sound of someone who is giving two other people a moment they need and is pretending not to know she is doing it. Caleb said, "Maylene." "Yes." "I want you to know." He stopped, started again. He was not a man who spoke easily about interior things, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "Both of you, I want you to know that whatever comes from Rollins or Cheyenne or anywhere else, whatever that resolves to, this is your home as long as you want it to be." He paused, not as something owed, not as shelter, as home. Maylene looked at him for a long moment. Her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. All the assessment and the directness and the careful management of what she revealed temporarily set aside, and underneath it something that was simply and fully human. "You mean this?" she said. Not a question. "I wouldn't say it otherwise," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "That is why it—" She stopped, took a breath. "That is why it matters." Lena came back from the kitchen with 3 cups and set them on the table and sat down and said nothing. But the look she gave Caleb as she sat, the brief, clear look that was not gratitude and was not quite something more but was pointed in that direction, told him that Maylene had been right. She had heard. She had given them the moment, and now she was back, and the 3 of them sat together around the table in the cabin that was becoming home to all of them, and drank their tea while the spring evening settled over the mountains and the river ran steadily below, carrying the last of the snowmelt south toward country they had all, in different ways, already left behind. 3 days later, 2 deputies from the Territorial Sheriff's Office arrived at the property with a formal notice that Abraham Briggs had been taken into custody in Rollins on charges of fraud, labor coercion, and criminal conspiracy relating to the attempted arson of a private property. One of his associates, the man Maylene had struck with the skillet, who had, it turned out, been wanted under a different name for a similar operation in Nevada the previous year, had provided a detailed account of Briggs's methods in exchange for reduced charges. The information had been considerable. The deputies were professional and courteous, and they spoke directly to the sisters without the particular quality of looking around them that men in official capacity sometimes adopted when addressing women they considered incidental. Caleb noticed this and supposed Fitch had chosen his people carefully. When the deputies had gone, the 3 of them stood in the yard for a moment in the afternoon light. The wind was down. The river was quieter than it had been. The snowmelt was mostly done, the water settling back toward its summer level, clear and continuous over the rocks. Lena stood very still, looking at nothing in particular. Her hands were at her sides and her face was turned slightly toward the sun, and she looked, for the first time since Caleb had known her, entirely without guardedness, as if the thing she had been braced against had finally been put down and she was learning tentatively what it felt like to stand upright without the weight. Maylene put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and Lena leaned into it without speaking, the easy, unconscious lean of someone resting against something known and permanent. Caleb looked at the river. The water moved over the rocks in its long, patient, purposeful way, going wherever it was going, carrying what it carried, shaped by the banks that held it, without reducing what it was. He thought about what Maylene had said weeks ago, that he was a man who had been waiting for it to be safe again. He thought about his father's handwriting in the margins of the Bible, noting frost dates, marking seasons. He thought about Daniel, who had believed everything would work out, and about the particular species of faith that keeps a person going, not because the evidence supports it, but because something in the character of the person demands it. He thought about a river that had tried to kill 2 women and instead had delivered them to a quarter-mile from his fence line. He did not draw a lesson from this. He simply held it. Then Maylene turned from her sister and looked at him, and what was in her eyes was the large thing she had mentioned, the thing she sometimes did not know what to do with. She was not hiding it now. And Lena, who noticed everything, turned and looked at him too, with that particular careful, complete attention. The look of someone who gives things slowly and completely, and has perhaps, in the weeks of shared hardship, and firelight and fever and fear, and the particular kind of knowing that comes from all of those things combined, made a quiet, final, irrevocable decision about what she intends to give. Caleb Turner, who had come to Wyoming to be alone and had built his cabin and his fences and his careful distances with great effort and considerable skill, stood between two women in his yard in the May sunlight, and understood, with the clarity that some things only arrive at after a very long journey, that he was not alone anymore. He was not sure when it had happened. He was not sure it mattered. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make supper." Maylene's expression did something complicated and then settled into something simple. "You cannot cook," she said. "I can cook," he said. "Not well, but I can." "That is not the same as making supper," she said, and walked past him toward the cabin door. Lena followed, and she touched his arm as she passed. A brief, light, deliberate touch, the first such thing she had offered in all the weeks, and it was over before he had finished registering it. But it stayed with him, warm and specific, the way certain things do. He stood in the yard for one more moment, alone in the way that a man is alone when the people he is with have just gone inside and will still be there when he follows. Then he turned and went in. The supper he made that night was, as Maylene had predicted, not good. He burned the bottom of the beans and oversalted the cornbread, and the coffee came out thin and pale in the way that coffee does when a man is distracted and measures by approximation rather than attention. Maylene ate it without complaint, which was more pointed than any criticism she could have offered, and Lena said that the beans had good flavor underneath the char, which was generous to the point of being fictional. Caleb ate his portion and accepted both responses as fair. What he noticed, sitting at his table in the lamplight with the two of them, was that the supper, bad as it was, felt like something. Not just a meal, an occasion of some kind, though no one had named it that. The deputies had come and gone. The formal notice had been delivered. Briggs was in custody in Rawlins, and his associates were dispersed, and the particular shadow that had been sitting over the property since the first afternoon those two riders had appeared at the fence line had lifted, not dramatically but cleanly, the way weather lifts when the system finally moves through. They were on the other side of something. The conversation over supper was different from the conversations of the previous weeks. Lighter in texture, as if the weight that had been present in every exchange had been quietly removed, and what remained was simply three people at a table, talking. Maylene told a story about her aunt's kitchen in San Francisco, a specific incident involving a neighbor's cat and a dried fish, and a sequence of events that escalated faster than anyone had anticipated. And she told it with a dry, precise humor that made Lena cover her mouth and made Caleb laugh. Genuinely, the unguarded kind, for the second time in his recent memory, which was more than he'd managed in any preceding year he could name. Lena watched him laugh with an expression that was warm and undefended, and when his eyes met hers across the table, she did not look away, which she might have done a month ago. She simply held the look for a moment, with something in it that was direct and deliberate, and that he received without deflection. It was, he thought afterward, a very ordinary evening. He was not sure he had ever been so grateful for an ordinary evening. Sad. The formal resolution from the territorial court in Cheyenne arrived 29 days after Fitch's first letter, 16 days ahead of his estimate. It came with a covering letter from Fitch himself, written in his characteristically spare legal language, which managed nonetheless to convey a certain satisfaction in the outcome. The debt claim of Abraham Briggs against the estate of Wei Chen and his surviving dependents had been ruled fraudulent and was dismissed with prejudice, meaning it could not be refiled. The original loan of $42, of which $27 had been repaid before Wei Chen's death, had been ruled settled in full on equitable grounds, given that the creditor had engaged in fraudulent record-keeping that had prevented the repayment of the remainder. Briggs himself faced criminal charges on 4 counts, including fraud, criminal coercion of labor, conspiracy to commit arson, and assault. His trial was scheduled for the following month in Cheyenne. The letters from Huangbo in San Francisco had been entered into the record and cited in the ruling. The territorial court had noted in language that Fitch said was unusual for such proceedings, and that he believed reflected the particular judge's feelings on the matter, that the documentation demonstrated a pattern of systematic exploitation of railroad laborers and their families that warranted further examination by appropriate authorities. Further examination, Fitch noted in his covering letter, was already underway. The Crestline Pacific Territorial Extension had retained lawyers in Cheyenne and was being very cooperative in the way that entities become cooperative when the alternative involves a public accounting of their labor practices in a territorial proceeding that several newspapers had already expressed interest in covering. Caleb read the letter aloud to the sisters, as Lena had read Fitch's previous letter to him, and he read it without inflection but with attention, giving each sentence its full weight. When he was finished, he set the letter on the table, and the three of them sat with it for a moment. "It's done," Malin said. Her voice was quiet and even. "The legal part of it," Caleb said. "Yes." "The rest of it was done some time ago," she said, and looked at him with those dark, level eyes. "For us." He understood what she meant. The legal proceeding was the formal conclusion of something that had, in the way of real things, already resolved itself in the weeks of fever and firelight and shared hardship and conversation at the kitchen table, and the particular quality of evenings when three people who have been through something together stop being careful with each other and start being simply themselves. Lena had the letter in her hands, reading it again, reading it the way she read things when she needed to be sure of them, thoroughly and twice. When she set it down, she looked at it for a moment longer. Then she looked at Caleb. "My father's name is in this document," she said. "Yes." "Wei Chen." She said it in Chinese, the tones of it precise and deliberate. "He is named as a person with a claim, with a record." She paused. "Not just as a worker who died, as a person who kept his agreements and was owed the acknowledgement of it." She was quiet for a moment. "He would have cared about that." "I think he would have," Caleb said. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in both hands. "I would like to send a copy to our uncle in San Francisco," she said. "Fitch will have a copy made if you write to him," Caleb said. "He'll send it officially if you want it to carry the court seal." Lena nodded. She set the letter on the table and looked at it one more time. Then she looked up, and what was on her face was not happiness exactly. It was something larger and more complicated than happiness. Something that contained grief and relief and the particular exhaustion of people who have been fighting for a long time and have finally, carefully, set down the thing they were fighting for because they no longer need to carry it. Malin reached across the table and covered Lena's hand with her own. Lena turned her hand over and held it. Caleb looked at the two of them and thought about Wei Chen in his work camp in the mountains, writing letters by lamplight to his brother, keeping receipts in his coat pocket, believing that the next stage of life was still coming, teaching his daughters to build things, to shoot, to manage blood and bad situations and the geometry of load-bearing structures, preparing them, without knowing it, for exactly the situation they had been required to survive. He thought that Wei Chen would have found something satisfying in how it had resolved. June came in warm and generous, the way Wyoming Junes occasionally did. Not the usual thin, grudging warmth of high-elevation spring, but real heat, the kind that brought the grass up fast and thick along the river and turned the upper meadows a green so intense it looked deliberate. Caleb was fully recovered by the first week of June, the stitches out and the scar settling into the permanent topography of his left side, another entry in the record his body kept of things he had survived. He had been thinking about the house for several weeks before he mentioned it. The cabin was not built for 3 people. It had been built for one man's particular requirements of solitude and practicality. And while it had accommodated 3 people through necessity and improvisation, it had done so the way any space accommodates more than it was designed for, adequately but without comfort. The loft was low and the main room was small, and there was no privacy worth mentioning, and everyone had been polite about all of it in the way that people are polite about things when the alternative would have been considerably worse. But the situation had changed. Briggs was in custody. The legal resolution had been rendered. The immediate necessity that had made the cramped accommodation not just acceptable, but genuinely irrelevant was no longer present. And in its absence, Caleb found himself thinking about the east slope below the ridge, a section of his property he had looked at years ago and considered and set aside, because a single man in a sufficient cabin has limited motivation to build a better one. He mentioned it one evening in the first week of June, when the 3 of them were outside after supper, sitting on the steps in the long Wyoming twilight that lasted until nearly 9 o'clock at this latitude and this season. The sky was doing something extraordinary to the west. The particular stratified colors of a high-altitude sunset, layers of amber and rose and a deep, saturated blue that darkened as it climbed. "There's a section on the east slope," Caleb said, "below the second ridge. Good elevation, sheltered from the north wind, spring-fed creek coming off the snowpack. Better timber access than here, he paused. I've been thinking about building. Neither sister spoke immediately. Building what? Maylene said. A house, he said. A proper one. Not a cabin. A house. More rooms. A real kitchen. Windows that face the river so you can see it from inside. He looked at the mountains rather than at them. Something built for more than one person. A silence. The twilight moved around them. You would do this, Lena said carefully, for us to stay. He turned and looked at her. I would do this because I want to, he said. Because the cabin was built when I was a different person with different, he paused, requirements. And because I would like a house that fits the life that's actually here, rather than the one I built it for originally. He held her gaze. Both things are true at the same time. Lena looked at him for a long moment with that particular, careful, complete attention that she gave to things she was deciding about. He had learned to let that attention do its work without trying to fill the space it occupied. Then she said, Can I design the kitchen? Something in his chest moved. Yes, he said. Maylene, who had been looking at the sunset with her knees pulled up and her arms around them, said without turning, The windows should face southeast. Morning light is better than afternoon light for a house. Afternoon light is for the outside. Southeast, Caleb agreed. And the porch should go all the way across the front, she said. Not just the door, all the way, so you can sit at either end depending on where the sun is. All right? And the kitchen needs to be large, Lena said. Not an afterthought at the back. A real kitchen, with room to work on both sides and a proper larder. I'll draw it up, Caleb said. Both of you tell me what you want in it, and I'll draw it up and we'll see what the materials require. Maylene turned to look at him then, and the sunset light was on her face, and she was not managing her expression at all. She was simply there, in it, present in the full, undefended way that she occasionally allowed herself when something had broken through the practical surface to the large thing underneath. You are a strange man, Caleb Turner, she said. I've been told, he said. Strange in a good way, she said. The kind of strange that comes from being entirely yourself regardless of what other people expect you to be. She paused. It is a difficult thing to manage. Most people do not. A beat. We noticed it the first day. What did you notice? He asked. She thought about it. That you said nobody is going to hurt you and meant it not as a promise of capability, but as a statement of intention. That you went to the kitchen and left us alone without being asked because you understood we needed the space. She paused. That you were lonely in a way that was chosen rather than suffered. She looked at him steadily. We talked about you that first night. In the loft. Yes, in the loft. She almost smiled. Lena said you were a careful man. I said you were a man who had been waiting for something he had not named yet. She tilted her head. We were both right. Lena, from his other side, said quietly, I also said you had very good hands. She paused. For the work. Caleb looked between them. I'm not sure how to respond to that. You don't need to respond to it, Lena said, with a composure that might have contained somewhere very deep under it, something that was almost amusement. It was a private conversation. You weren't meant to know. And yet, Maylene said. And yet, Lena agreed. The sunset finished its business with the sky and left behind it the deep, soft dusk of a Wyoming June evening, full of the sound of the river and the nighthawks beginning their passes over the meadow, and the particular quality of silence that is not absence of sound, but presence of everything that doesn't need words. But they broke ground on the new house in the second week of June. Caleb had spent 5 days on the plans, sitting at the table with paper and pencil while Lena sat across from him with her own paper, sketching the kitchen layout with the systematic precision she brought to structural problems. Her father's lessons evident in every decision she made about where load-bearing walls should go and how the roofline should meet the chimney. Maylene contributed to these sessions by sitting nearby and saying things like, the pantry needs to be on the north wall, and you've put that window too low, you won't be able to see the ridge from seated. Observations that were, without exception, correct, and that both Caleb and Lena incorporated without discussion because there was no useful counter-argument to accuracy. The final plan showed a house that was considerably more ambitious than the cabin. 2 main floors, 4 rooms, a kitchen that occupied the full southeast corner with the large windows Lena had designed to catch the morning light, a covered porch that ran the full width of the front face, and a stone foundation that Caleb estimated would take 2 weeks to lay properly before any timber work could begin. He had never built anything this large alone. He was not going to build it alone. He rode to the Henderson homestead, 3 miles north along the river, the same homestead he had told the sisters to run to that first night when Briggs had come with 4 men, and spoke to a man named Grant Henderson, who was 60 years old and had built 4 houses in his life, and who regarded the plans Caleb showed him with the concentrated squint of a man who has opinions about joinery. "Southeast corner's going to need a double header over those window openings," Grant said. "That's a lot of glass weight." "I know," Caleb said. "Can you help?" Grant looked at him with the shrewd, measuring look of a man who has seen Caleb Turner pass his property every month for 6 years and never stopped to do more than raise a hand. "Heard you had some trouble this spring," he said. "Some," Caleb said. "Heard it got resolved." "It did." "Heard you've got people staying," Grant said. He was not a man who asked direct questions about other men's affairs, but he was also not a man who pretended he hadn't heard what he'd heard. 2 Chinese women. "Yes," Caleb said, not offering more, not defending it. Grant looked at the plans again. He looked at them for a long time, long enough that Caleb thought he was going to find a reason to be somewhere else. Then he said, "I can give you 3 days a week until the frame's up. My boy's old enough to manage the stock." He rolled the plans up and handed them back. "My wife's going to want to know what they cook. She's been making the same 4 things for 20 years, and she'd welcome a change." Caleb looked at him. "I'll mention it." "You do that," Grant said, and went to get his tools. The foundation stone came from the creek bed and from the lower slope of the east ridge, and it took 12 days of work that left everyone involved with abraded hands and aching backs, and a deep familiarity with the particular weight of Wyoming granite. Caleb and Grant's son, a quiet 18-year-old named Thomas, who had his father's shoulders and his own way of moving through work that suggested he would be a builder of things for the rest of his life, laid each course with the care that foundations deserve, which is the care of people who understand that everything else depends on what's underneath. The sisters worked the site, not as observers, as workers, in the specific and practical sense of people who show up every morning, do what needs doing, and treat the question of what women are supposed to do in such situations as a question belonging to a different conversation than the one currently happening. Lena managed the materials, tracked what had been used and what remained, calculated what would need to be ordered from Rollins before the next stage, and caught an error in the window header calculation on the 4th day that would have caused a problem 6 weeks later. Malin carried stone and mixed mortar, and on the 6th day when Thomas Henderson slipped on the wet foundation edge and came close to dropping a dressed stone on Grant's foot, reached out and caught the stone with both hands and a braced stance that kept it from falling. Grant looked at her. She looked at him and set the stone down where it needed to go. "Strong," Grant said. "Yes," Malin said, and went to get another. Grant looked at Caleb with an expression that contained in compressed form a complete revision of whatever he had previously thought about the situation at the Turner property. The frame went up in the 3rd week of July, and the sound of it, the hammers and the timber and the particular resonant crack of a joint being driven true, carried across the east slope and down to the river and back again. A good sound, the sound of something being built rather than endured. On the day the ridge pole went up, Lena stood back from the frame and looked at it with her arms crossed and her head tilted at the angle that meant she was checking measurements in her mind. "It's right," she said. "It's right," Caleb agreed. She looked at him. In the summer light, her face was open and clear, the last traces of the watchfulness she had carried when he'd first known her worn away by months of safety, by legal resolution, by the particular erosion that happens to necessary armor when the thing it was armoring against is no longer present. "My father would have liked this," she said, "building a thing." "Tell me about him," Caleb said. "Tell me something I don't know yet." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the frame against the Wyoming sky. Then she said, "He sang when he worked. Not loudly, not so you could hear the words from far away, just to himself. A kind of accompaniment." She paused. "Malin sings the same way. She doesn't know she does it." Caleb filed this away. He had noticed the sound from the kitchen sometimes, a low, wordless hum that he had attributed to the wood stove and that he now understood differently. "He would have liked you," Lena said. It was said simply, as a statement of fact, without the weight of implication, though the implication was present and both of them knew it. "He would have argued with you about things because he argued with everyone about things, and he would have respected you because you build carefully." She looked at the frame again. "He said you could judge a man's character by whether he cut corners in the work no one would see." Yet Caleb thought about the foundation they had laid, each course level and true, the mortar joints full and properly tooled, all of it under a floor where no one would look at it for the next 100 years. "I think I would have liked him too," he said. The house was weather-tight by September. The interior work, the floors, the plaster, the kitchen fittings that Lena had designed with the precision of someone who intends to use them seriously for a long time, took through October and into November, during which the Wyoming autumn arrived in its usual abrupt fashion and reminded everyone that the mountains had opinions about the calendar. Grant Henderson came twice a week through September and once a week in October, and by the time the first snow fell, he had developed a habit of arriving with his wife, Clara, who had indeed heard about what the sisters cooked and had indeed come with the specific intention of learning about it, and who sat at the old cabin table with Maylene while the men worked and had conversations that Caleb was not privy to, but whose results were occasionally audible in Clara Henderson's subsequent remarks to her husband, which Grant relayed to Caleb with the resigned patience of a man who has long ago made peace with the fact that his wife's opinions on most subjects are more interesting than his own. It was Clara who organized in the first week of October what she described as a finishing party, a gathering of the 4 or 5 neighboring families within reasonable riding distance, brought together ostensibly to help with the final plastering and floor laying, but actually, as became apparent within the first hour, organized around the sisters, around meeting them properly, in the context of a neighborhood that had heard what had happened that spring and had its own views about it. The views, Caleb discovered, were not what he had steeled himself for. The Hendersons had apparently done some prior work in this regard, because the families who came, the Pratts from the South Pasture, the Morrow family from up near the ridge, an older couple named Beauchamp who had been in the territory longer than anyone, and who had a particular moral authority in the community that derived simply from outlasting everything, arrived with the manner of people who had come to meet neighbors rather than to inspect curiosities. Maylene, who had been prepared to be precisely and politely herself, regardless of reception, was taken slightly off guard by this and responded to it with the particular openness that surprise sometimes produces in people who have been managing expectations for a long time. She fed everyone. She fed them with the systematic generosity of someone who has learned that cooking for people is the most direct available language for welcome. And she fed them things they had not tasted before, and things they recognized in new combinations. And the results were received with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of people who have been living on their own cooking for too long. Lena talked with old Beauchamp for 2 hours about construction, about which he had strong opinions, and about the railroad, about which he had stronger ones. And by the end of it, he had offered, with the blunt directness of a man who doesn't waste words on preamble, that if the sisters needed a character reference for any legal or community purpose in future, they had one. Caleb watched all of this from the partially finished kitchen doorway, hammering a floor plank into position with one ear on the conversation and one on the work, and felt something he did not have a precise name for. Something in the vicinity of what it felt like, he imagined, when a thing you had given up on reassembled itself from the pieces you thought were permanent losses. Clara Henderson came and stood in the kitchen doorway beside him and looked out at Maylene managing the outdoor fire and Lena deep in conversation with old Beauchamp and the various Henderson and Pratt and Morrow children making a project of the riverbank. "They're going to be all right," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes," Caleb said. "So are you," she said. She had the particular tone of a woman who has been observing something develop over months and has arrived at conclusions she sees no reason to withhold. Caleb hammered the next plank and did not comment. "Grant said you haven't had anyone to supper in 6 years," she said. "Grant talks a good deal for a quiet man," Caleb said. "He does when something's worth talking about," she said, and went back out to the gathering, leaving Caleb with the floor and his own thoughts for company. The first night they slept in the new house was the 3rd of November, with snow already on the ground and the river running dark and quiet below its skim of early ice. The house was not entirely finished. There were details still to be done. Trim work and a second coat of plaster in the upstairs rooms, and a kitchen shelf that Lena had designed but that they hadn't gotten to yet. But the rooms were warm and the floors were solid, and the windows faced the directions they were supposed to face, and the kitchen caught the last of the November afternoon light in exactly the way Lena had drawn it, the pale gold of it falling across the work surface in a long rectangle that moved slowly east as the sun went down. They ate their first supper in the new house at the table Caleb had built for the kitchen, wider than the old cabin table, room for more than 3 if it came to that, which it would, he suspected, in the way that houses built for more than one person have a tendency to accumulate the right people over time. After supper, they sat in the main room where the fireplace was, the big stone fireplace that had taken Grant and Caleb 4 days to build, and that drew perfectly and threw heat into the room with the steady, reliable generosity of well-built things. The fire was high, and the room was warm, and outside the snow was falling again, light and steady, the way Wyoming snow falls when it intends to stay. Maylene was at the window, looking out at the dark river and the falling snow. She had been quiet through supper, not with the watchful quiet of the early weeks, but with the interior quiet of someone who is holding something large and looking at it. Lena was sitting near the fire with her knees pulled up and her father's pocket watch open in her palm. The one she had carried from the work camp, the one that had survived the river, and all the rest of it. She looked at it for a long moment, then closed it with a soft, final sound and held it in her closed hand. Caleb was in the chair across from her. He had been watching the fire. "Lena," he said. She looked up. "Are you all right?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was thinking about the word home," she said. "What it means, whether it is a place or whether it is something else." She looked down at her closed fist around the watch. "In our village, home was the place your family had always been. It was fixed. It was there whether you were in it or not." She paused. "After our mother died, and then our father, and then everything else, I thought perhaps home was something that had been used up, that we had had it, and it was gone." She looked up at Caleb. "I was wrong about that." He held her gaze. "What is it then?" She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to things that deserved it. "It is something you make," she said finally. "Not find, not return to. Make. With whatever materials are available." She paused. "With whoever is there." Maylene turned from the window. She looked at her sister and then at Caleb, and in her expression was the large thing, fully present, fully unconstrained, the thing she had said she sometimes didn't know what to do with. She crossed the room and sat beside Lena on the hearthrug, close in the way that twins are close, the proximity of two people who have shared everything since before memory. She leaned her shoulder against her sister's, and Lena leaned back, and they sat together in the firelight looking at Caleb with an openness that was complete and offered without condition. He had been a man who built walls, and then a man who maintained them, and then a man who had sat in a cabin alone for 6 years, practicing the management of a life that was entirely within his own perimeter. He looked at the two women on his hearthrug in the new house they had all helped build, in the firelight, with the snow falling outside and the river moving quietly below the slope, and he understood that the perimeter had changed, not dissolved, not abandoned, changed, expanded to include what it had always, without his knowing, been large enough to hold. "I want to ask you something," he said. Both of them looked at him, waiting. "I want to ask you to stay," he said, "not as guests and not as obligation, as the people who live here." He paused. He was not a man of large speeches, and he was not going to make one now. "I don't know what that looks like exactly, in terms of what we call it or how it goes. I know those are things that matter, and I'm not dismissing them." He looked at Lena. "I know that you think carefully about things. I know that this needs thinking about." He looked at Maylene. "And I know that you say what you mean, so I'm saying what I mean." He paused. "I want you here, both of you, for as long as you want to be, whatever that becomes." A silence. The fire shifted and settled. The snow fell outside in its steady, patient way. Lena looked at the watch in her hand. Then she opened her fist and looked at it. The small brass disc with her father's initials on the back, worn smooth where his thumb had rubbed it over years. She looked at it for a long moment, with an expression that carried grief and gratitude and something forward-facing in equal measure. Then she looked at Caleb. "My father told us once," she said, "that a man's choices are the only things that truly belong to him." She paused. "I believe the same is true of a woman's choices." She held his gaze. "I choose this." He looked at Maylene. She was already looking at him, with the directness that was simply her nature, unmediated and complete. "I chose this some time ago," she said. "I was waiting for you to catch up." Something in Caleb Turner, something that had been held in careful, necessary tension for 6 years and perhaps longer, released. Not dramatically, not with any external evidence, just a quiet internal shift, the settling of something that had been braced against a pressure that was no longer there. He almost said something, decided that what had been said was sufficient and that adding to it would reduce it. He got up from the chair and went to the fireplace and sat down on the hearthrug with them. Not on the chair across, but there, in the warmth of the fire, with the two of them on either side of him and the new house around them and the Wyoming night outside doing what Wyoming nights did, indifferent and enormous and entirely uninterested in the small, specific, irreplaceable thing that was happening within these walls. Winter settled over the property with the thoroughness that Wyoming winters bring, deep and absolute, the snow coming up to the fence posts by December, and the river going silent under its ice, and the world reducing itself to the space between the house and the barn and the distance a man could see from the porch before the white took everything. It was the best winter Caleb could remember. Not because it was easy. It was a hard winter, the kind that tests animals and stores and the quality of a man's construction, but because it was inhabited. Every morning he woke to the sound of Maylene in the kitchen and the smell of coffee and something on the stove and the low, barely audible hum that he now recognized as her father's habit in her, the private accompaniment to work. Every evening he sat at the wide table with Lena's reconstruction project spread across one end and his own ranch paperwork at the other, and Maylene somewhere between making things or reading the books that Caleb had accumulated over years with the haphazard logic of a man who reads whatever comes to hand. They wrote letters. Lena wrote to the uncle in San Francisco with the court document and a long letter that took her 3 evenings to compose, in Chinese, about what had happened and what had resolved and what came after. The uncle wrote back, a long letter, formal and emotional in equal measure, that Lena translated for Caleb in the kitchen one afternoon while Maylene listened from the other room and did not come in but was very quiet, in a way that indicated she was hearing every word. The uncle would come, the letter said, in the spring when the mountain passes opened. He would come to see that his brother's daughters were well. He would bring, the letter added with a formality that could not quite conceal the feeling underneath it, the things from his cedar box that belonged to Wei Chen's family. Maylin, from the other room, said nothing. But when Lena finished translating and looked toward the doorway, Maylene was standing in it with an expression that she was not managing at all, and Lena crossed the room and put her arms around her sister and held on, and Caleb looked at his paperwork and gave them that. Spring came the way Wyoming spring always comes, grudgingly at first, then all at once, the snowpack releasing in a rush that filled every creek and tributary and brought the river back to the full-throated roar it had been the day Caleb had heard screaming from the bank and run without thinking. He walked to the river on the first warm afternoon of March, the snow still deep on the shaded slopes, but the south-facing ground already showing the first green suggestions of the coming grass. He stood at the bank where the fallen cottonwood had been. The tree was gone, washed away in last year's flood, and looked at the water. It was brown and fast, and carrying the winter's accumulated weight, the way spring rivers do, full of power and direction. It looked very much as it had a year ago. It had no opinion about what it had done or what had followed from it. It simply moved, as rivers do, from where it had been toward where it was going. He heard footsteps behind him and turned, both sisters, together, as always, as they would probably always be because that was the nature of them, the deep and permanent togetherness of people who began the same and had never been made to be anything but what they were to each other. Lena in the coat she had bought in Rawlins when Caleb had ridden down in January for supplies, which fit her correctly and which she wore with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has not owned something that fit them correctly in a long time. Maylene, with her hair loose in the wind off the river, which she only did outside, away from the work of the kitchen. They came and stood beside him, and the three of them looked at the river. "This is where it started," Maylene said. "Yes," Caleb said. "It does not look the same," Lena said. "The tree is gone." "The water's the same," Caleb said. "It just looks different depending on the season." Maylene considered this. "That is true of many things," she said. They stood there for a while, the three of them, with the sound of the river all around them and the mountains above and the new house visible on the slope behind them, the roof line against the sky, the southeast windows catching the afternoon light, the covered porch running its full width across the front, the stone chimney sending a thin thread of smoke into the clear March air. Lena said, without looking away from the river, "Do you remember what you said to us? The first night?" "I said a lot of things the first night," Caleb said. "You said, 'Nobody's going to hurt you.'" She paused. "And then you said you try to be a kind man, that you don't always manage it, but you try." "I remember," he said. She turned and looked at him, and in her face was everything she had learned to keep contained over a year of hard circumstance, fully released now, as open as the sky above the ridge. "You managed it," she said. He looked at her, then at Maylene, who was watching him with those dark, level eyes that saw clearly and without adjustment, the eyes of someone who has always known what she's looking at. He thought about a man who had lived alone in a cabin for 6 years, building his walls and maintaining them, and calling it sufficient. He thought about the river, which had tried once to kill 2 people, and had instead delivered them to him. He thought about choices, and what they cost, and what they return. He put his arm around Maylene's shoulders. She leaned into it without hesitation, the way she leaned into things she had already decided about. He offered his other hand to Lena, and she looked at it for one moment. The moment she always took, the one deliberate breath before the complete giving, and then took it. The river moved past them, south toward open country, carrying the winter away. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The new house waited on the slope above, solid on its stone foundation, built for more than one person, its windows facing the morning. The lonely rancher who had once ridden into this valley with nowhere particular to go and had decided, for no reason he could name, that this was as far as he was going. He stood at the bank of the river that had changed everything and held on and did not look back. There was nothing behind him now worth looking back for. Everything worth having was here.